to improve fertility of our soils and, crop nutrition, and as well as to suppress plant diseases. Because yes, we can make things to suppress plant diseases from our home or from our, basic things that are around us. Now, I'm not sure if everyone is hearing me clearly. So if any one of you guys aren't hearing me clearly, I just would like you to just indicate such, whether by just unmuting your mic. I think everybody's mic are muted. So just by unmuting your mic or by just indicating in the chat. But if there is no such indication, I will continue. All right?
Hearing.
So Josephine, are you hearing me clearly?
Hearing, yes, I am hearing.
Excellent. So I'll just ask that when you're finished, if you have an input, nothing is wrong. You can either use the standard format of raising your hands, or you can actually unmute your mic and make a comment. In the case where there's not much comments to be made, or probably just one or two persons want to speak, I think it's okay to unmute your mic. But I guess if we have an interactive session, I think that probably the raising of hands section, which I'm not sure if this is in Zoom, because I've been using Blackboard Collaborate so much. So I don't know if Dr. Isaacs can confirm if that raise of hands or, that way to indicate that you want to say something is actually in Zoom. Because I haven't used Zoom.
Morning, Mr. Smith.
No, I was just asking.
No, Miss Green. No, hold on. I am a part of the host.
Okay.
So you let me know when you're ready for questions and comments. Yes. And then I will let you know who has questions, and then I can unmute their mics, and then they can speak with you. Or if there are any questions in the Zoom chat, I can also do that for you. So you just let me know when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Ms. Green. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
All right. So without further ado, I will get started. And I have a PowerPoint here that I will share with you to go throughout the entire course outline of what we'll be doing today. There's some minor changes to what you guys would have received. I added some stuff, but nothing major. The general gist of it will be, in terms of the expected outcomes, will still be achieved at the end of the session. All right? So let me just share that with you. So I'm not sure if you guys are currently seeing.
Yes, I could see the PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, and is it now on full screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay then, excellent.
Awesome.
Good. Let me just move this thing up here. All right. Good. So today we'll be looking at growing media, soil fertility, and crop nutrition. Right? So what we'll be looking at basically in terms of our overview, we'll be looking at the benefits of home gardening. I'm sure that's something that Dr. Isaacs or whichever facilitator you would have had before, if you had any, would have gone through as well. So just a brief overview of that. We'll be looking at growing media, soil texture, pH, EC, and nutrient availability. Don't worry about some of these terms if you have never been exposed to them. I will break it down as simple as I can just for you to get the general understanding. We'll be looking at composting, vermicomposting, and their teas. And teas doesn't mean the tea that you drink in the morning, but this is a liquid extract. And we'll be looking at compost, vermicompost quality, properties and use, and plant nutrition. And we're looking at something with disease suppression as well. Now, I want to bring a bigger picture to you because I'm very passionate about agriculture, and I'll give you a little background about me. That when I wanted to come to university to do agriculture, I remember everybody told me something. Everybody said, "Why are you going to do agriculture for?" And at the time, I had gotten through to do law and doctor of dental surgery. And at the time, everybody thought that agriculture was just the worst occupation or the worst career path that I could choose because they just saw it as farming. And it made me realize how persons undervalued farming or undervalued the whole idea or process of eating and obtaining food and the importance of food, meaning that food has such an important, part of our life in terms of, just alleviating discomfort. We're be, for example, even some level of poverty. If you have food, there's some level of satisfaction. The fact that food also is medicine, because without food, we won't get the nutrients that we need to function in our daily basis. So it was, you know, a little bit surprising for me, but I'll tell you what, the fact that persons were telling me, why am I going to do this? And I shouldn't do this. Even my own mom at one moment was, you know, was questioning that career choice and thought that a more secure choice like teaching, etc., would have been better. But I wanted to prove them wrong. And I wanted to change the mindset of young people and professionals, just everyday persons who really engage in agriculture. It doesn't mean that you have to study agriculture, but you have to have an appreciation for things that grow, for the animals that are around us. We have to have an appreciation for this. So I want to show you the bigger picture by sharing this experience, and that there are no mistakes in gardening, only experiments. And a lot of you guys would realize this as you guys have gone through the gardening process, that you guys plant something and sometimes it dies, sometimes it catch. But one of the things that you find very interesting about the gardening process is that as you do it over and over, you get better at it, because you recognize something that would have happened before, and you recognize something that would have worked to fix that challenge. So, you know, I call all of us scientists. And the next part is that gardening is cheaper than therapy, and you get tomatoes. So at the end of the day, you get something, and gardening is very therapeutic, going out, you know, really tending to something, caring for something, and seeing something come to fruition. You know, it's just like, for example, we look at the skills and talents that, you know, that God gave to us. At the end of the day, you understand, how do we develop this? How do we turn this into something greater? It's the same thing for gardening. We have a seed, we have sown a seed, and this seed comes to fruition and comes to something that can be of substance, something that can help, something that can be fulfilling, you know, or something that is just aesthetically pleasing at the end of the day. So what are some of the benefits of gardening? The first major benefit of gardening is that you get to control what you eat. You control your crops. So by controlling your crops, you're controlling your inputs and what you're able to place on your crops. So let me give you an example. Let us look at lettuce. Lettuce is something that a lot of us purchase in the market. All of our green vegetables that we don't cook. Can you imagine, for example, purchasing lettuce from a farmer or somewhere out there, or from the market, and you don't know if this lettuce that you're purchasing, if the farmer applied pesticides 2 days before harvesting, if that pesticide residue still remains on this lettuce, and what you're putting in your body. Because at the end of the day, the lettuce stays the same way. But the fact that you can control your crops when you have your own home garden gives you control of the food that you allow to be consumed, and as well as, by extension, your health status in the long run. It helps to save money. A lot of us run to the groceries to buy, you know, we have different names for it all over the Caribbean, because Dr. Isaacs told me that there are different persons from the Caribbean. So we have scythe, we have chive, we have scallion, you know, different names for it. But imagine going to the store to buy these things in the supermarket, when these are things that you can just simply plant in your backyard, whether in a container or in the ground, to replenish something that you use very frequently. So it saves money. It increases physical activity. So for some of us who can't go to the gym, etc., it's a form of physical activity to get moving, right? And it doesn't have to be in the hot sun. It can be in the evening or early in the morning. Also, you get to reuse a lot of the waste that we produce. And we'll speak a little bit of this as we go further into the module today. That is not just about just applying the waste in our garden, which a lot of us do. We have the empty banana skin, we have this, and we just throw it in the garden. These things can actually be detrimental. And one of the things that we're going to deal with today is how to deal with these green waste, these food waste, how to convert them in a form that is safe when we apply it to our crops. The next thing is that it increases property value. So when we're, you know, for some of us who probably are in real estate, you know, probably have rental properties, or probably don't see ourselves living at that property for the rest of our lives. These things, when we plant these crops, particularly tree crops, not necessarily short-term crops, they increase the value of our property. Mangoes, you know, bananas, you know, all these fruit trees, they add value at the end of the day. So we head straight into the first part of our module today, which is growing media. Now, what are growing media? Growing media are basically anything that can support plant growth. And You know, when we look at growing media, there are certain things that allows us to characterize something as a growing media. And generally it has to do with these three things that we're going to speak about that the soil contains. Now, one of the main growing media that we are exposed to is the soil. And it's around us. Everywhere we go, we see our soil. We walk on soil. You know, it's used for engineering purposes. It's a habitat for microorganisms. You know, it helps to purify the air and also helps to, you know, to purify some of our water sources, our underground water sources for anybody who, you know, who is from, let's say, Barbados or Antigua, those limestones. So the soil is very important. But in the case of, let's say, gardening, the soil serves three main purposes. And the first purpose is that it anchors the plant. Where the roots go, and the roots serve as that process or that tool of the plant to really hold it upright. It also stores nutrients, and it contains minerals, which are the nutrients, the air, water, which is contained in the pore spaces. It contains organic matter, and it also contains the organisms. So some of us, we see the earthworms, you know, we see some of these small microorganisms within the soil. And we don't want to kill these things, and we'll speak about them a bit later. These things are very important in terms of a healthy soil. And when we see these microorganisms, they tell us that we have a healthy soil. So when we look at soil, there are three basic mineral particles. So if you remember what I was saying earlier, I said to you guys that the soil contains the mineral component. So if we think about the soil as a whole, 100%, there is the mineral component that makes up about 45%. There is that organic matter part that makes up 5%. And that organic matter is generally that litter that falls from the tree, that is on the surface of the soil, that dark humus looking material on the top part of the soil. We also have the pore spaces, which is the other 50%. And the pore spaces can fluctuate with water or with air. So for example, if we have heavy rainfall, sometimes you see our soils flooding, so that we to the point where we have runoff, it means that our pore spaces are full or saturated or at saturation point with water. And there's sometimes when we look at our soil, it's very, very dry. And this means that our soil is devoid or without any water at all. So when we look at the three basic mineral particles or mineral components, we have sand, silt, and clay. And these three mineral components combine in different ratios to give us the texture of our soil. And there are basic ways for us to understand how to test for our texture of our soil, because the texture tells us what the soil is capable of managing, what can we plant in our soil, or what kind of management or alteration we have to do to our soil to get it to be at maximum productive capacity. So the three components are sand, silt, and clay. Of the three mineral components, sand is the largest mineral component. And generally, these are very visible to the eye, each of the mineral parts. And when we go to the beach, we see our sand. We can take up a grain because, you know, it's visible to the naked eye. Then we have the silt. And we find our silts, for example, in our rivers, very smooth in texture in comparison to our sand that is very gritty, right? And then we have our clays. Our clays are microscopic particles that we can't really see with the naked eye. And our clays generally, when we feel it, they're very sticky. It's almost like a Play-Doh texture, very sticky and mucky, right? So there are certain physical characteristics when we feel our soils that are distinctive of these three basic mineral particles. So depending on how they mix, our soil would have certain properties. Now, before I get to the soil texture, one of the things that I want to say to you is that in terms of sand, silt, and clay, I want to ask this question, and I'm hoping Miss Green, I hope that I got the name right, can assist me in terms of just navigating the chat here. But
no problem.
Which one of these, thanks Miss Green, which one of these do you think would drain water the quickest? And which one of them you think would retain water the most? So that's the first question that I'll ask, and I'll ask the participants just to respond in the chat, just to get a feedback of, you know, where you are at and what you think about these three mineral particles. So which one of them drains water the quickest out of sand, silt, and clay? And which one of them maintains water the longest, or holds on to water the longest?
So far, the responses are, oh, hold on. Renee says silt. I'm not sure which question she's answering. Oliver and Sharita says sand. Oh, okay, Oliver and Sharita says sand drains. Sharita says clay holds. Oliver says clay retains water. Caroline says sand. Ambi says sand drain, silt maintain. Anne Marie says sand drains water quickly. Miss Blackman says sand drains the fastest. Renee
Okay,
says sand drains.
nice, Mrs. Green. No,
You're
thanks for the
welcome.
feedback. And you know, you guys are correct, absolutely correct, that sand drains water the quickest. And we experience this when we go to the beach. When the waves wash up, we realize that the sand quickly dries out. And the reason why the sand drains water the quickest is because the pore spaces are larger. So because the pore spaces are larger, we tend to characterize this material as being more porous. So the water within the pore spaces tend to drain out very easily by that gravimetric flow. And you know what we mean by gravimetric flow or draining of water? Just imagine being upstairs and letting go, let's say, a ball from upstairs and it falls to the ground. Gravity is that force that is pushing the water to the ground. So similarly, in these different minerals, you know, the water can move by gravity pulling the water downwards or draining the water downwards. And in our sand, this happens the quickest. In our clays, as we said, very microscopic particles that we can't see with the naked eye. These particles are so small that they create ultra micropores or micropores. And also something that I won't get into much here, but clays are generally electronegative, so they hold on to the water particles. So the water particles generally are very difficult to move out of our clay, which is why when we have the clay soils, we find that it's still a little bit moist or damp when we look at it. So here we have a soil texture triangle. And one of the things in our soil texture triangle, we can test soil texture in the laboratory. And in the laboratory, when we test soil texture, one of the things, as I said to you, based on the size, these textures will drop or will fall differently. Like, for example, sand will fall the quickest because it's the largest particle, then silt, then clay based on the size. Now, I won't get into this in terms of the laboratory method, but I showed you this textural triangle for you to have an appreciation that when clay, silt, and sand mix together, what happens is that depending on the percentage that they're mixed together, we have different soil textures. And these different soil textures will indicate to us our productive capacity and how we need to manage our soils once again. Now, there is a particular soil mixture that I want to zoom in your attention to, and that is our loam soils. Now, our loam soils generally we characterize as the ideal soils to grow on or to use. And our loam soils generally are a mixture or ideal mixture of sand, silt, and clay. Because remember, each of them have different properties that we kind of like or we kind of want to mix to get the ideal gardening soil. Because we don't want to have a strictly sandy soil. Because if we have a strictly sandy soil, it means that we have to be watering a lot. It means that we're going to have leaching of our nutrients. And if we have a strictly clay soil, it means that it's going to be difficult to dig because it's going to be sticky. It's going to be wet and gooey and all of these different things. Now, one of the things I want you guys just to have a perspective of is, I'm not sure if you guys, particularly in the other islands, if you guys ever drive on the road yet and you realize that the road just bumpy, like you ever realize that when they pave the road, after they pave the road, for those of us in Trinidad, when you go to, like, let's say down south, Princestown, etc., you realize the road just gets very bumpy, and no matter how much they pave it, the road just continually to just break apart after a while. Now, what happens there is because of the soil. Now, when we have our clay soils, for example, there's some clay soils that are very expansive, and we call these soils clay soils, expanding clay soils. So when they're wet, they swell. So they look swell and larger, they swell. And when they're dry, they shrink and crack. Now, can you imagine getting rainfall and periods of drought? It means that our soil will what? Swell and dry over time. And that intermittently swell and shrinking causes what? The cracks on the road. So I'm just showing you or giving you a perspective for you to an experiential perspective for you to understand how important the texture of our soils are in our everyday life, more so in our gardening. So we said that the ideal soil is a loam soil. And we look at this image here, we realize it's a dark, rich soil. And this is the type of soil that we love to see. We love to see this dark, rich soil because it tells us, hey, what? We have a lot of nice organic matter in our soil. It tells us that it's a rich soil when we see our microorganisms or like our earthworms inside there. So let us not try to kill our earthworms. Our earthworms are very beneficial and they're harmless. We want the earthworms. Now, if we see the maggots and the cockroaches and stuff, that is a different case. But if we see the earthworms, we want these. Bacteria and fungi, very important. We want a soil that is not a waterlogged soil, so it drains very easily. So I'll speak to you guys about, for example, some of you guys that have very clay soil, we'll have to amend that clay soil with a bit of sand, sharp sand, etc., to increase the drainage of those soils so that we implement or we incorporate some larger particles to increase the drainage. So, and for some of us, let's say who have that has very sandy soil, we want to incorporate some organic matter, some mulch, some compost, things that can hold moisture to kind of increase the moisture holding capacity of our soil so that our sandy soils can hold the moisture and the nutrients and they don't drain as much. So when we look at a loam soil, we want to ensure that it's crumbly, it's fluffy, it has an earth odor, it's dark brown to black, and it usually has a pH between 6 and 7.5, and we speak about pH a little bit further. We say we want to encourage our earthworms, bacteria, fungi, and we want to ensure that it's a well-drained soil. Because remember, just as how we respire, meaning that we can't stay underneath the water, and we can't stay in a, let's say, a toxic environment with a lot of smoke. It's the same thing for the plants. They require oxygen to respire, right? And they utilize carbon dioxide, and also the fact that when they respire, you know, they exchange gases basically, and therefore we need to have those pore spaces in the soil for the exchange of gases. So if you have a waterlogged soil, our plants will die. And if we have a soil that is always well drained without any water, our plants will look flaccid or look wilted, and they will eventually die, succumbing to drought stress. So we go into soil pH. And when we look at soil pH, you know, there are some nutrients here that some of us will probably be familiar with, and we'll speak about some of these nutrients, particularly the major ones as we move forward. But if you look at some of these nutrients, some of the major ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And for some of us that goes to the gardening shop to buy some of these, you know, fertilizer to apply to our soils, we know them as N for nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium, right, in shortened form. And I know that when we go to let's say the gardening shop, sometimes you see the fertilizer that mark 20:20:20. And we ask ourselves, what does this 20:20:20 mean? And it is simple. What it means is basically the ratio of N, P, and K. And remember we said that N stands for what? Nitrogen, P stands for phosphorus, and K stands for potassium. So when we see this ratio, it tells us the ratio of these nutrients in this granular fertilizer or liquid fertilizer mix. So if we see, let's say 20:20:20, it is saying to us that they're in equal proportions. But if we see, for example, 40:10:10, it's telling us that this is a higher nitrogenous fertilizer, low in phosphorus and low in potassium. So right away, because we know that this is what the proportions generally mean, we can say, okay, if we're at the beginning stage of our plants that generally require phosphorus, let's say for root development, and nitrogen for foliar, and we get into that a little bit further as we go on, we know that we need to have a fertilizer that has higher ratios in the first two, which is N and P. So we want to have something like a 20:20, and let's say a 10, because we're looking for something that's gonna have what? A higher nitrogen for foliar and a higher phosphorus for what? Root. So that is just a little guide, and we'll get into that a little bit further. But for here, we want to focus on soil pH and why soil pH is very important in terms of nutrient availability for our plants. Now, what is pH? In the simplest form, pH basically is how basic or acidic something is. And we have certain household things that we use, and based on these certain household things, some things are acidic and some things are basic. So I'll ask this question again, just for a general acceptance or understanding of pH. Can the participants tell me what are some household things? Just give one example of a household item that is acidic and a household item that is, let's say, basic or alkaline.
So Bryan, while the participants give their responses, would you like to have your video on or off?
I will, if you want them to have their video on or off, that's the question.
No, do you want your video on or off?
Well, I can work with it off, seeing that I'm explaining. I'm not sure if you guys prefer it on, if the participants prefer it on.
It's always good to see the presenter's face while he's speaking.
Okay, not a problem at all.
All right. So the responses are coming in. Avoni says Epsom salt. Oliver says lime is acidic. Ali says vinegar is an acidic substance. Lady J says Epsom salt is alkaline.
Okay, nice. What about anybody? What about baking soda? Can anybody tell me what are some of the
Renee just said it. Baking soda is alkaline.
Excellent. Excellent. So right away, and we talk about apple cider vinegar, all of these things, and there's this awareness about taking in alkaline food because alkaline is slightly better for us. And I'll say this to you that neutral is the best, right? But generally, we do have household items, and let me just put on my video, as Miss Green is saying. I'm not sure if you guys are seeing me.
Yes, we can see you clearly.
Okay, excellent. So generally, we want to we understand that there are alkaline and acidic materials that we have around our household. And, sorry, I think I skipped a slide ahead. And basically, it's the same thing here. So we look at how acidic and how basic something is when we are looking at, let's say, how acidic, the pH of something. But in scientific terms, pH is basically the negative log of hydrogen ions. Right? So that's what we speak about pH. And when we're speaking about pH, we're looking at basically the amount of hydrogen ion, the concentration of hydrogen ions in the bulk soil solution. So that's what we're speaking about when we're speaking about pH. But we have an appreciation of what pH is. So when we look, for example, here, if we look at some of these nutrients, you realize that they're right in the middle, meaning that they're right at 7. So pH has a scale of from 0 to about 14. The closer we get to 0 is the more acidic it is. And the closer we get to 14 is the more basic it is. And 7 right in the middle basically indicates to us that this is a neutral substance, or it's of neutral characteristic. So here we realize that majority of our major or macronutrients such as NPK, as well as our secondary macronutrients such as calcium and magnesium, are available in the neutral zone, 7. And we realize that some of the macronutrients, the micronutrients, such as iron, manganese, boron, and these things, even they're available in the neutral zone, but some of them, we can get them, let's say, down towards the slightly acidic, towards to the slightly alkaline range. So it says to us that here what? We need to ensure that our soil is a bit alkaline. And I know some of us home gardeners are asking, how do we know then if our soil is acidic or alkaline? And I'll tell you this much, that generally, in our gardening soils, depending on where we're from, like let's say in Trinidad, most of our soils are acidic, about 5.5. And that is just the natural nature of soils, because soils are formed from weathering of rocks over time. These big bedrocks weathering over time. So generally what we do is that we lime if our soils are too acidic. And what does liming mean? Liming is basically, when we speak about liming materials, we're speaking about materials basically that we add to the soil that will increase the pH of the soil or raise the pH of our soil. And some of these things we know as agricultural lime, like calcium carbonate, dolomitic limestone, all of these different liming materials. And what happens is that we incorporate these things in our soil, like for example, the limestone, and over time, it raises the pH. But we have to be careful of how we apply it, because if we apply too much, it will raise the pH past a particular level. So as a home gardener, how do we test the pH? There are simple things that we can purchase. And I'll go this far and tell you that at this stage, we really don't want to kill out ourselves about soil pH. We want to ensure that our soils are healthy. But I will tell you that there are little test kits that you can buy online that are very cheap, about 20 something US dollars, that you can order online. And it's just simply opening like a little tablet, putting your soil in there, adding a little bit of water, shaking it, and you see a color change. And based on the color change, it doesn't give you an accurate reading, but it gives you basically a range of the pH that we have there. So we want to have a pH that is generally neutral to ensure that a lot of our nutrients are available when we add, let's say, our compost, when we add, let's say, our fertilizers, etc. So I hope everybody is following thus far. I know that some of it is a little bit of heavy content, but I hope that everybody is following, because some of us probably don't have that science background, but I hope the explanation is clear thus far. And if it is not, just indicate such, and I'm always willing to explain a bit further. So now we're going to speak about soil EC. And what does EC mean? EC represents electrical conductivity. And in a simple layman terms, we're speaking about salt. So like when we go to the beach, ever realize that when the salt touches our eyes, or when the salt reaches on our skin, it either scratches or it burns our eyes? It's the same thing for the plant. When we have salt, if we have probably, let's say we're cooking and we add salt to the pot. When we add salt to the pot, what is gonna do? We can't really enjoy the food. In terms of when we place it on our tongue, we generally want a lot of water. We feel dehydrated, and it's the same exact thing that happens to the plant. Oh, it burns, the salt burns us, for example, when the sun hits our skin. The same exact thing happens to the plant. Soil burns and affects the plant. As a matter of fact, if we have a soil that has a high salt concentration, water will move from the plant into the soil to actually kind of dilute the salt that is in and around the root. And if water moves from the plant, it means that the plant is going to become what? Flaccid and wilted, and you're going to start to see these problems. So generally, we want a salt content that is less than 4 decisiemens per meter. And again, I won't get a lot into that. I will in a more pragmatic manner, explain to you guys how do we maintain the salt content of our soil. So if you look here, we realize that in this control treatment here, or in this control, these plants that we have here, if you look here, we realize that the plants are taller, look much greener in comparison to the plants here that are grown in a high salt medium. And we see it over here too in the next picture. What this is saying to us is that salt affects our plant. How do we manage salt? We have to be mindful of the things that introduce salt into the soil, similarly to how we are mindful about things that introduce salt into our diets. So things that introduce salt into our diet are like the salty biscuits and all of these things. We stay away from it, or we minimize buying these things with high salt, and we buy the biscuits without salt, without this high salt content. And it's a similar thing. Salts are introduced to fertilization, through, let's say, even compost can introduce salts. So one of the things that we have to bear in our mind is that how often do we fertilize? That we don't fertilize too often. That we monitor how our plants look, and we identify basically how to apply, or develop a scheme of how to apply, which we'll discuss a little bit later on in the session. But we understand that salt, if our salts are high or our EC is high, it can affect our plants. So there are other growing media that we can speak about. You have peat moss. So for those of us who buy Pro Mix, or the green formula, which is that thing that comes dark and white with the white crystals, which is what we call perlite. These are the white substances. And the peat moss. For those of us who buy this in the gardening shop, let's say for potting media, etc., we utilize these two growing mediums actually, peat moss and perlite. Peat moss is generally formed, like, say, I don't know if you guys have, let's say, these wetland places, like say these swamps. And at the bottom of the swamp water, we have organic matter. But because this organic matter is not exposed, let's say, to sunlight, it won't break down or degrade as quickly. What will happen is that it will break down very slowly because it's under what we call anaerobic. There's no oxygen really conditions underneath the swamp. So it breaks down very slowly, and that is what we use. Peat moss is a very inert. What we mean by inert? Not reactive. It doesn't have much nutrients, but it holds water excellently, which is why it's a good growing media. And the perlite there that we see also helps the plant to have proper drainage, because what it does, if you realize the perlite, it's very larger. So it creates more larger pore spaces for the water to drain. And vermiculite, similarly, does the same. Perlite and vermiculite are very similar, different minerals, but very similar in terms of what they are used for, right? In some of our hydroponic system, for some of our growers that probably have a hydroponic system in the backyard planting our lettuce, we will use a lot of perlite vermiculite because it's a physical medium that can hold the plant upright, but it won't probably, let's say, have the moisture content to hold the moisture like the peat moss. But let's say in a hydroponic system, because we're supplying the nutrients through the water, there's no need for that, like in the peat moss and in the soil. So we can use the perlite and the vermiculite, etc. in instances where we have these hydroponic system. For some of our growers that, let's say, love to plant orchids, we utilize gravel, which is even larger, have larger pore spaces, and water quickly drains through gravel. And we know that orchids aren't water-loving species generally. We see them growing, let's say, on trees, etc. And we have coconut core, which basically comes from the coconut trash, the inside, the heart of the coconut, and that also can be a good growing medium. We generally use coconut core again in our orchids for those of us who like orchids or purchase orchids. We move on a little bit further to look at other growing mediums apart from soil. And some of these growing mediums that we have that are apart from soil are compost and vermicompost. And we'll get into this a little bit further into the session. And I want to highlight something to you here. If you look here, we're looking at our starting material. And when we look at our starting material, I will tell you what is inside of this starting material. We have neem leaves, we have cow manure, and we have, what is this again? Corn stover in our starting material. And one of the things that you will recognize is that these materials are very visible. You can see each one of the components clearly. You can see the leaves here. You can see the corn stover here. And these little dark patches are the cow manure. Also, this was probably 4 days after mixing or starting the composting process. And one of the things you will also recognize is this white mat. And this white mat is basically fungus, right? Fungi that are actually breaking down or helping to break down the material starting to develop inside of the substrates that we would have used to mix the compost. We would realize that in comparison to the starting material, when we look at our compost and vermicompost, our compost is very distinctively different. It is more homogeneous, meaning that it has one distinct look. And when we look at this compost and vermicompost, we realize it's very dark. It's very earth-like. So we understand that the material physically has transformed. And when we have compost and vermicompost, this is what we're looking for in the end product. So a lot of us, and I'll dispel that as we move forward, that a lot of us think that composting is basically taking organic materials and waste and piling it together. And after piling it together, over time, it breaks down, and that is our compost. And I like to dispel that. That is not composting, or neither it is vermicomposting, because vermicomposting engages earthworms. Composting is a controlled process. What is happening there is basically decomposition, which occurs naturally, or biodegradation that occurs naturally in nature. So when we, let's say, go on a hike, or we go somewhere, or even in our own backyards, we know that waste over time, organic materials or organic waste that comes from, let's say, our plants or trees, or even our animals, for those of us who live near a farm, etc., they break down over time. And that is what we call decomposition. Microbes are inherently associated with these materials, and they break down with the elements, which is the rain, the water, everything over time. in composting and vermicomposting, it's a controlled process. And because it's controlled, there are certain things that we monitor for to ensure that we have a safe product at the end of the day to apply on our soils or in our soils. Now, when we look at vermicompost here, these are earthworms that we have here. And these are actually the species of earthworms here that we have, I think, are Eugilus eugeni, or something that we call night crawlers. For those of us who want to look up, you know, earthworms. Because these earthworms are found locally in Trinidad, and they can be found locally in our islands, actually, for us to use them in vermicomposting. And I'll discuss this a bit further in terms of the type of earthworms that we want to look for when we're doing vermicomposting. So as we get into composting, I'd like to share something with you. Money is like compost. It's not worth anything unless you spread it around. And what do we mean by this? We mean that when we have our compost and our compost broke down, similar to what we saw in the previous slide that we just looked at here, for compost to be useful, we have to spread it, we have to integrate it in our soil. And when we integrate it in our soil, because the compost, as we saw here, the microorganisms are breaking down the compost. Our compost now is now rich of microbes that are beneficial, and I'll speak about this, this benefit further down, to our soils, as well as they provide slow release of available nutrients to our soils so that our crops can obtain these nutrients to support their growth and nutrition. Here, what we have in this image, we have here what is known as a rotary drum. For some of our backyard gardeners, we can use a static pile, meaning that we just pile this up and we probably put a tarpaulin over it or a cover over it, and it breaks down over time. But we know, for example, in the Caribbean, we have two distinct seasons, a wet and a dry season, right? So therefore, sometimes the environmental conditions can actually affect compost, and I'll discuss that a little bit further. So what we have here is a decentralized unit known as a rotary drum composter or in-vessel system. And it's not a very difficult thing to make. It's actually a 55-gallon drum. If you turn this little drum here vertically upwards, you realize it's a drum that you can get, let's say, from any local manufacturer, thereabout. You see here that we would have cut it open here. That's the flap here that we introduced the material. There's a little closure here. And we bore holes throughout, you know, using specifications. We bore holes throughout. And for those of you guys who want the further information on this, you can always tell Dr. Isaacs or, you know, indicate such, and I can give you more information in terms of, you know, the dimensions, etc. And inside, there's a handle here, and inside what you have is almost like spokes. And these spokes, imagine this inside. So you have one going down, then you have one going up, then you have one going down again, all the way inside. So just imagine these handles similarly inside. And what that is for is basically for agitation of the material. Because we want to agitate the material to ensure that it is properly aerated, right? Because remember, we said we need the air, right, to facilitate proper breakdown and not create anaerobic conditions. And when we mix, this is the mixture that we have going on here, where we have the corn stover, the neem leaves, and the cow manure. And when we mix this, we place it in the drum. So I want to speak a little bit about the mixing process. And before I speak about the mixing process, I want to know very much just give you a brief overview of why we want to manage our organic waste and how we can manage our organic waste. What is composting and what is vermicomposting? So why compost and why vermicompost? The first thing is that it's an easy thing for any home gardener to do, especially the composting. We can do it. We can't use a little 5-gallon bucket and do it though. We need something that's a bit larger than a 5-gallon or what we call a pigtail bucket. And the reason why we need something larger than a pigtail bucket is because the pigtail bucket doesn't facilitate bulking or things coming together. Just imagine all of us like in a room. And if a lot of us are in a room, one of the first things, because we respire, one of the first things we realize is that we're very what? We get very hot because of that respiration, because of that body heat. So that heat is very important in the composting process, which is why we want bulking, which is why we want something that is bigger than a pigtail bucket. In vermicomposting, that's a little bit different because we have organisms or living organisms inside the vermicompost, which are the earthworms. And we don't want that heat because that heat will damage or destroy the earthworms. So why compost or vermicompost? It's an alternative treatment technology for waste disposal. So, you know, we often throw a lot of this organic waste into our garbage, and this end up into our landfills. And then our landfills, you know, smell a little bit awful. You know, we have a lot of negative impacts from the landfill where we have runoff into our water that we're drinking, you know, that forms our drinking water and all of these different things. So we want to manage our waste. And as much as possible, recycle our waste and bring it back to the earth, because we're taking from the earth in the first instance. So let us reintroduce back this waste or some portions of this waste back into the earth. So let's give back to Mother Nature. The next thing is that it helps prevent environmental pollution and degradation. It reduces waste materials dumped in landfills, as I indicated earlier, and it saves money. And the reason why it saves money, because it's a low-cost process. It doesn't really require much, and the end products are beneficial, and I'll speak about the benefits later on in terms of increasing plant nutrition, providing fertility for the soil, as well as suppressing plant diseases. So, what is composting? Ms. Green, am I doing okay? Any concerns there in the chat?
You're doing good. Yes, we have some questions.
Oh, you have some questions. So let me just stop here and go through the questions before I continue.
Okay, so Sharita is asking, can you use other animal manure besides cow?
For sure, you can definitely use other manures apart from cow. You can use goat manure, sheep manure, guano, which is bat manure, any single manure. Once it is organic, it can be used. As a matter of fact, manure is what we call our seeding material. And why we call it our seeding material is because it introduces the microorganisms. Remember, you know, when we think about, let's say, the cow has a gut that basically, remember the cow is eating what? Grass. And it requires microorganisms to break down these grass, which is why we can't eat certain grass, like fiber and all of these things just goes through our body. But the cow has the microorganisms to kind of break down the fiber, the high cellulose. And these microorganisms end up in the fecal waste or the dung. So yes, we can use different forms of manure.
All right, another one is when you were talking to us about how to test our soil, somebody asked, is there a preferred soil test kit to use?
Yes, I will send you the preferred, there's this one that is very cheap. Actually, it's a kit that contains pH and nutrient. So all you do basically is that you add a little bit of soil. Instructions very clear. There's like a little tablet, you know those tablets that you get normally, like those herbal tablets especially that come in the capsules. So you just open the capsule, you add it to the soil, then you add the water, you shake, and there's a color change. And based on the color change indication, you get a range. And that range gives you, let's say, if your nitrogen is too high, too low, if your phosphorus is too high, too low. And it's a nice thing for home gardeners because it's just simple. And you don't need that complicated high laboratory, you know, type of machine, etc. You can buy these simple testings. As well as, you know, if you want to be a little bit more scientific, you can even invest in a pH meter. You can get a cheap pH meter, cheap EC meter for as much as, let's say, $50 US dollars. You can invest in one. So rather than, let's say, buying, because remember these are tablets that you know, over time they will finish. You can buy this meter and you can have this meter. You can use this meter, let's say, for even your compost pile and your soil. And if you want to, let's say, go on to train others or explain to others or show them.
Are there preferred times to use the test kit? For example, if I'm starting my gardening today, I test the soil and I test it another 3 months, another 6 months.
Excellent. So how would we want to utilize our test kits? We want to utilize our test kits with different criteria, and I'd state 3 major criteria. The first criteria is that we want to test before. And the reason why we want to test before, similar to when you go to our doctor visit, the doctor does preliminary test. And the preliminary test gives baseline information of what is your existing state and what do I need to do to bring you to the best possible state that I can bring you to, or what that I can bring the soil to in the case of the soil. So I want to do a test, ideally, before I start to plant or before I do whatever major thing that I'm going to do. So let's say before I even want to fertilize, I'll do that test to get an idea. Okay, because oftentimes our soils are already in the appropriate ranges, and we add these things, and what we do is that we just create a buildup of salt. We add unnecessary fertilizer, or we over fertilize and we waste money, and some of these things run off or leach off, etc. So you want to test before. Also, when you say, if you test before and let's say you realize that it's below the recommended, that means that you will have to add. And the best way to add, it's a calculative way actually to add, but the best way to add is always to add at an appropriate ratio. And what I mean by an appropriate ratio, if the instructions tell you, let's say, mix let's say 2 tablespoons to a gallon, we are going to literally, it's almost as if, and I want to be very clear, because this is very difficult to actually tell you how much to add, because you see, adding ad lib, what I would say is to add piece by piece. And as we go through, there are certain things that I'm going to show you about plant nutrition that you can observe on your plants. And when you observe these things, you will be able to detect that, this nutrient is in low concentration. And if this nutrient is in low concentration, it means that I need to add a little bit more, right? It's almost as if when you're cooking and you add, and that this is the best way I can explain it to a home gardener. You add a little bit of salt and you realize that, no man, the food tastes a little bit fresh. And I'm careful with the term fresh, because I found out that in Trinidad they use fresh differently. But fresh means that it's without salt. So, you add a little bit of salt or you add a little bit of sugar until you get it just right. But the reason that you know that it is just right, because you can taste it. And in this case, the reason that you know that it's just right is because there are certain physical things that you're looking for on your plant, especially as a home gardener. So you want to do that. And the second time that you want to test is that you want to test, let's say, after you have harvested. And let's say you've harvested and, you want to put down another major, growing thing. You want to test the seed, and that's probably like after 3 months thereabout. You want to test to see, okay, where am I at? And if you realize that, okay, the soil's still good, man, you develop a kind of a rhythm to know that, okay, I don't have to fertilize this often. I can fertilize, let's say, every 6 months, or I can only fertilize often when I'm planting this crop. So you develop a rhythm over time. And as I said, you become the expert and you become the scientist that in your own home garden.
Excellent. I have a question of my own. When you were speaking about the 3 basic types of soil, I thought of red clay soil, and how is that in terms of planting?
Okay, excellent. So when we look at our red clay soil, or what we call, in Jamaica we call it our bauxite-rich soil. So it has a lot of iron ore inside of it, or iron, oxidized iron. That is why you get that red color, because of the oxidation of the element or the mineral or the nutrient iron within the soil. So it means that this soil generally has a lot of oxidation of iron when you see this kind of red looking. As a matter of fact, the opposite of that is what we call glaying, when we see kind of almost like a gray color. And I think that's more of a reduction, if I believe, of the iron. But to the main point of the question, when we have this, or that doesn't mean that our soils aren't productive or that we can't plant in these soils. It just says to us that, hey, this soil has a high concentration of certain particular things. And because it has a high concentration of these particular things, you're being mindful. You don't want to now over supply your soil with too much, the micronutrient iron or things like this. But when we have our red dirt or red soil, as we call it in our islands, it does not mean that these soils aren't productive. And something that we won't get into in this session, but colors of soils also gives us an indication of the status of soil. It is not generally all the time correct, but let us say, for example, if we see a light colored soil versus a dark colored soil of that same type of soil, it is telling us when it is light that, hey, we can discern that the light color means that it's lacking moisture. And if we have a darker hue or a darker color, it means that it has what? Higher moisture content. So color gives us an indication of a number of things, but we have to generally get a bit of experience before we can tell the color. I will go on and add to that answer, Ms. Green, that and I didn't cover it, but when we're testing our soils, there is something that we have called a field test that we can do to test the physical texture of our soils. Now, what we do is basically, all of us, most of us, I would hope, know how to knead dumpling, or at some moments in our life, you know, try to knead dumpling. And when we knead a dumpling, one of the things that we know about dumpling, imagine the flour is the soil, and we're adding the water. We don't want to add too much water, nor do we want to have what? Too little water. Okay, if we have too little water, it's going to be dusty. And if we have too much water, it's going to be plucky and difficult to, you know, to maneuver. So it's the same thing for when we're testing the texture by feel. We add a little bit of soil, and when we add this little bit of soil, the next thing that we do is basically add a little bit of water, almost like kneading it like dumpling until it's like a dough, a nice dough like the dumpling dough. And then from that, the first thing that we do is to squeeze it into a ball. When we squeeze the soil into a ball, if it remains in a ball, it tells us, the first important things it tells us is that it is not a sand. If when we squeeze it into a ball, and some of us can try it with our soil outside, if we need it like to that dumpling consistency, and we're taking up about a good spoonful of soil, right? To fill about half of your hand, depends on the size of your hand, and we're adding the water ad lib. When we squeeze that soil in that, you know, that dough consistency, and we realize that it crumbles, and obviously it will crumble because it's large grains coming together that are coarse, it tells us that, listen, our soil is a heavily sand-based soil. If when we squeeze that soil, it remains in a ball, it tells us that, listen, this soil is going towards a loam, silt loamy, and more of a clay kind of soil texture. The next thing that we do is that when we squeeze it and it remains as a ball, we try to form what is known as a ribbon. And how I always think about the ribbon is that that ribbon that you put in, you know, those school children, the female hair, you know, those ribbons that you tie in the hair, you want to make like a ribbon. And how I would normally make the ribbon is to place the ball that I have formed between my index and my thumb, and I will just press it, almost like press it out, and roll it out like I'm rolling it into a piece of ribbon, or stretching like a ruler. And as I'm stretching, I'm looking at where that breaks. And I can upload a schematic diagram to assist. Again, I'll just ask Ms. Green or Dr. Isaacs to remind me. And if that ribbon stretches very far, it tells us that it's a clay soil. If it doesn't stretch very far, it tells us that, listen, it's somewhat of a clay, silty kind of soil. If it feels very smooth, that stretchy material, that material that forms a ball, if it feels very smooth, it tells us that it's silt, because silt is very smooth. If it feels very sticky, it tells us that it's predominantly clay. So there are different feel, method by feel, and obviously as you do it more often, you become better at it, that can tell us the soil texture.
Awesome, thank you. Can I give you 3 more before you continue?
Go ahead.
Okay, so the next question by Gina is there a way to test without access to a kit?
Test what exactly?
The soil. To test the pH of the soil without access to a kit.
I want to say yes, but I don't want to explain it right now because I would have to do a little bit more research into it. I would like to say that the test that you would do without a kit, it's, how to put it? You have litmus paper, right? Which is our basic thing, but it would be a little bit, you can't get a proper depiction of what the pH is without a kit. Let me put it this way. So for example, we can, you know, when we add baking soda or certain things, we see fizzing, you know, or we add certain things like vinegar to stuff, you know, we see certain reactions taking place. It would tell us that, listen, one is acidic. Yes, this is acidic. Yes, this is basic, based on the color change or based on the physical thing that we're seeing. But it doesn't necessarily tell us the range. I remember that the range is what we're really concerned with. But generally, especially in our backyards, we expect a range between 5 and 8. And within this range, we can still get things to grow. It doesn't mean that it will grow optimally, but for your home garden, it is generally acceptable. For those of us who want to kind of take it a little bit step further and really invest in a home garden that is productive, that gives us, you know, something that we can cut costs, we want to probably invest a little bit in these very inexpensive kits to kind of discern the information that we want to make the proper management decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So I'm going to give you 2 more and then the others. When another segment of question and answer come, I'll share it with you. This
Not
is
a
from
problem.
Joy. She's asking if you could use vegetable peelings and fruit skins for compost.
If you can use vegetable peelings
and fruit skins for compost.
all right, that's a very important question, and and the reason why I say it's a very important question is because yes, they can be incorporated in the compost mixture, but from a home gardening level, I will say to you to not put a lot of these things in your compost mixture. And the reason why is because think about the orange skin. It is very acidic in a way. Even when we're peeling it and we get that rind, you know, some of us sneeze, some of us find it highly uncomfortable when we're peeling an orange and all of these things. And these organic acids or these acids that are, you know, and other compounds that are ascribed to the orange peel and these peels, etc., particularly citric acids that are ascribed to these peels can actually slow down the composting process and affect the composting process if they are placed in the compost or oversupplied in the compost. So what I would say to you is, yes, you can dry the peel and incorporate it, but don't put a lot of peel. Right? You can find other things to use your peel around the household. Make your orange cake, make your orange peel tea, you know. There's so many other things that you can use the peel for, you know. You can make sprays because some of the orange peel can be used for certain insects as well too because of the same citric acids. So, you know, there are different things that you can use the peel for, but I would say to manage how much peels you place in the compost.
Awesome, thank you for that question, Joy. And the last one before you continue, Mr. Smith, is Sintra. She's asking if you can mix the different types of manure together in the compost.
Yes, we can definitely mix the different types of manure together in the compost. And I'll go on a little bit further as I get into the composting to really speak about how we do the mixture. Because the mixture isn't as simple. We have these things and we put them together and we get compost. Yeah. No, it's really a mixture of carbon and nitrogen. And I'll tell you how from a household level or from a basic gardening level, how we really discern how much of what to place and how much of what to mix to get the appropriate composting conditions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Smith. So you can continue until the next question and answer segment.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So thanks very much, guys, for the questions. So the question that I'm gonna, well, not the question, but I'm going to define something for you guys, and the definition is really is, what is composting? And composting is the controlled, and if you realize I've highlighted controlled, it means that it has to be in a controlled environment, and control means that we have predominant control over it, meaning that we are managing it, we are monitoring it. We are dictating what is being added to it, what is being taken out of it. That's what I mean by control. In nature, decomposition of organic matter isn't controlled. It occurs naturally. And therefore, we cannot really guarantee the quality of the product, of the end product that we obtain. And because we can't guarantee the quality, when we utilize these naturally decomposed products into our gardens, what we are really doing is sometimes introducing toxins or things that can have severe negative effects on our plants. And I'll explain that when I go further. So we say composting is the controlled biological. It's biological because really and truly, what breaks down the compost are the microorganisms. The microorganisms are the main agents that really break down the organic material. And in composting, what we have is mass loss. So we might start out with a big pile, and at the end of it, we lose less than half, more than half, sorry, of the mass or the density or the pile height at the end of it. We lose all of that because it is being broken down. So carbon is being lost. Carbon is being lost, nitrogen is being lost, as well as being utilized by the microorganism to carry out their function. So we say composting is a controlled biological breakdown of organic materials, and we know what organic materials are, in a predominantly aerobic environment under conditions that generate high temperatures by thermophilic microbes. And thermophilic just means microbes that thrive in temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius. And we end up with a stabilized product, and we define what stability is, free of pathogens and weed seeds, and with humic-like properties. And we'll discuss what these terms mean for those of us who aren't familiar with them. So we said that it's a control, and we explain what we mean by control. We are monitoring what we input. And in speaking about control, one of the things that I want to speak about firstly is how do we decide how much material, how much of what to mix into the compost pile. The first thing I'll say to you is that we want to ensure that we have a ratio of 30 to 1, but we don't have anything to test that ratio. So I'm going to explain to you even further how by eye or by looking, we can have an idea of which material is mixed with carbon and which material is mixed with nitrogen, which are the two major things that we want to mix in appropriate ratios to facilitate proper composting, the increase in temperatures, and the biological breakdown by the microorganisms. So generally, we characterize our carbon as our browns, and we characterize our nitrogen as our greens, right? So when we see brown things, we say, okay, it has a higher carbon. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have any nitrogen, but it means that it kind of have a higher carbon. And the reason why we say it have a higher carbon is because over time in our browns, it loses the color, which is the green, and the green is associated with the chlorophyll associated with nitrogen, because nitrogen helps in chlorophyll development. So we know over time, when our materials move from, like our leaves, move from green to brown, we know that there's kind of like a loss in nitrogen. There's loss in carbon as well, but we know that there's a mass loss in nitrogen over time, which is why it changed to brown. And we know that there's, for example, a buildup, for example, of the remaining carbon, which is why we associate our carbon to being our browns. And in contrast, we associate our nitrogen to be our greens. And you know, we say that when we look at our plants and we see them very green, like our lettuce and stuff, we know that we need a lot of nitrogen. And when something is even too green, we say it have too much nitrogen, and that can also cause some negative effects. But our nitrogen are associated by that green color. How much do we need? I would say that we need a ratio of 4 to 1. And I will start simply by looking at a ratio of manure to, let's say, dry grass. Yeah, let's say dry grass. And the reason why I'm saying dry grass, because we can find that around us when we whip our yards, you know, the same Johnson grass, razor grass, all of these things, corn, whatever it is, the brown material or leaves around the place, all of these are what we characterize as our brown materials. So we need 30 parts of brown material, sorry, not 30 parts, 4 to 6 parts of brown material to 1 part of nitrogen. And the reason why we say, even though we said, listen, it's 30 to 1, the reason why we broke it down from a basic home gardening perspective to 4 to 6 of carbon, we're talking about portion. So if you have a pigtail bucket, we need 4 to 6 of that brown material to 1 pigtail bucket of that green material. That's what we mean by that ratio, right? And the reason why we broke it down to that is because you remember that green material also have what? Carbon. And that brown material also have what? Nitrogen. So essentially it comes up to that compostable ratio that is allowed, that it facilitates the microbes to break it down. But from a basic scale, we need 3 to 6 parts of the brown to 1 part of the green. And if we're thinking about a pigtail bucket, we need 3 to 6 of the pigtail bucket of brown to 1 pigtail bucket of the green. Now, obviously, we would need to increase that ratio, meaning that we would have to multiply each of those ratios by, let's say, about 5. Because remember, if we're composting, we need what? The bulk. We need the bulk, so we need what? The materials to pile together so that we can generate that heat as well. So we can't just look and say, okay, we're going to take 4 pigtail buckets of the brown 1 pigtail bucket of the green, mix that together, and we get a proper compost. No, we need enough material. So sometimes we can collect our material over time and have it there breaking down over time, or have it in the back part of the yard until we're ready to really, put it together. We collect our leaves together so till we know that we have enough material to do a proper compost pile, right? And as I said, we can utilize our vessels, which are like our drums that we have holes in. But if we utilize our drums, it means that we have to turn it out and mix it and put it back in to aerate it ever so often. And in our piles, we have to turn it, right? So basically, we're looking at our ratio. We're looking at 4 to 6 parts of brown to 1 part of nitrogen or green, right? And we want to scale that up, meaning that we're going to scale up the 4. Let's say we're working with 4 parts of carbon or 4 parts of brown to 1 part of green. We want to scale up that 4 parts, let's say times 3. So we're looking at what? 4 threes is what? 12. So that's 12 parts of brown, 12 pigtail buckets of brown to, let's say 1, we're scaling it up by 3. 1 times 3, that's 3 pigtail buckets of green. So we still have the same ratio, of 4 to 1. But what we would have done is just basically scale it up so that we have enough for the bulk of materials to facilitate the development of the temperature. So,
Mr. Smith?
Yes?
Is it ground material that you said?
No. So, but if we can cut up the material, let's say chip it up, that is better, because the smaller the material, the better access the microbes have to break it down and break it down much more quicker. If it is larger, as we can see, let's say when we have our stems and our, our branches fall, you notice that those take a long time to break down. If it's larger, it will take a much longer time before you can get the end product to use. So if you can break it down, no problem. It's a better thing to do. The smaller you can get it to, the better. If you can use a whip, for example, when you whip the grass and you get it small, or when you have certain smaller particles, it's better to mix those than to mix the larger particles.
Okay, I was just asking in terms of pronunciation. Did you say ground material or raw material?
Oh, right, ground. So raw, I would love to say raw, and in some cases, yes, I would love to say ground as well.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes, no problem. So we have these materials. So let's say that we mix our materials together. Let's say we understand our portions, right? We mixed our materials together. When we mix our materials together, the first thing we have to do is add water. And guys, when I say add water, I mean a lot of water, because these materials are generally very dry. I want to literally incorporate them when they're dry. Because when we incorporate them when they're dry, we have a better idea of the ratio. Because if both materials are dry or air dried, we can have a better idea or guesstimate of the ratio. But if one material wet and one material dry, we're over exaggerating one ratio over the other. So we want to ensure that both materials are air dried. When we mix these materials together, we're going to add a lot of water, guys. I want to say add a lot of water. And I'll share this video with you guys on the Facebook group in terms of the mixing process. We're adding a lot of water to the point where when we take up the material and we do what is known as a squeeze test, that's basically taking the material and place it in the palm of our hands. And when we squeeze the material, water is supposed to run through our knuckles, right? And that water, the water running through our knuckles tells us that, listen, hey, we're at a level where the material is saturated. And it's okay for the material to be saturated at this point. Because when we put it in a pile or if we put it in a drum with the holes, the excess moisture will drain out. And when this excess moisture has drained out, we now have what? These aerobic pores or aerobic pockets that air can come in. So we're creating that aerobic environment after the moisture has drained out. But that moisture is important to what? To get the material soft so that the microbes can start to act on it, as well as the microbes require this moisture as well. So when now the microbes that are associated with the material, they start to say, okay, yes, now we need the carbon and we need the nitrogen. The microbes require the carbon for energy, for building. The carbon I would love to describe as our go foods, or yam, banana, dumpling. The things that give us the energy to go, the carbohydrates. That is what the carbon is like. So seem like how we need that to carry out our functions is the same way the microbes need that carbon. They also require the nitrogen, and the nitrogen is like what we get from our protein. or meats, etc., or beans. We get the nitrogen from these things. In the same way that the microbes require the nitrogen, right, to carry out for their cell metabolic functions, to develop, to grow new cells, to do whatever they have to do, to reproduce. So they need these two major nutrients, as well as others, but these two major nutrients to do things. So if the ratio is off, they can't function. Similarly, if we don't get too much carbohydrates, for those of us who used to run probably when we were younger, you remember the teacher used to give us some glucose in our hand, and we taste the glucose, and the glucose is supposed to give us the energy to go faster. It's the same thing. The microbes require the carbon to start function. Similarly to us, we require that carbon to start functioning. So the appropriate portions are very important. Now, when the process starts and the microbe starts to break down the material, immediately there's an increasing temperature after 24 hours. And if the compost pile is set up properly, meaning that you add enough moisture, you did the squeeze test, the moisture drain out when you put it to stockpile, you know, whether in the vessel or whether under the ground, immediately after 24 hours, we move into what is known as the thermophilic phase or the high temperature phase, where temperature exceeds 45 degrees Celsius and can get up to about 100 degrees Celsius. And even, you know, so it can get very high. And yes, high to the point where it can even burn you. And that is when you know that, yes, the composting process has been kick-started. Because what is happening or what is creating this high temperature is the microbes respiring. And I used this example earlier that when all of us is in a room, you would realize that we get hot. Because guess what? A byproduct or something that occurs because of respiration is heat. That apart from carbon dioxide being released, heat is produced. And because all of these microbes, you know, they're eating, they're reproducing, so the population increasing, heat is generated. But this heat is very important in the composting process. Why is the heat important? And that is one of the ways that you can know if you're doing a natural decomposition or when you're putting the material together and you realize you're not seeing heat. All you're seeing is cockroach. You're smelling this high ammonia scent. It don't smell too right. That is how you know when, listen, something wrong with this compost. I have too much nitrogen. It's too wet. Something is off. I have to troubleshoot it. But when you get that high temperature, you know, all right, I did something okay. So this heat is important for two major reasons. If we have this heat for, let's say, continuously 55 degrees Celsius and above, for let's say 3 to 5 days continuously, it automatically kills the pathogens or reduces the pathogens to a limit where it's no longer harmful. So pathogens can come from what? The co-manure. I remember some of these pathogens, as we're seeing with this COVID-19, can be what? Can transfer from animals to humans. So we want to ensure that we have that heat to really, you understand, help to kill and denature some of these pathogens that can be harmful to us. Or most times they're not harmful to us, but they're harmful to the plants because we might be composting a plant or a material that have a plant pathogen that can affect our plant. So because we have these high temperatures, it denatures these pathogens. The next thing is that these high temperatures also denature the weed seeds. Can you imagine when we have these high desert temperatures, how no plant can grow there? So just imagine these weed seeds. They become denatured and therefore the seeds associated with the material that you're composting, like the grasses, etc., become denatured and therefore there is a low germination rate at the end in the composting material from these weed seeds that would have composted. So therefore you don't get a lot of weed growing in your garden. And when we say humic-like properties, we're talking about that dirt-like property that we saw earlier. We want to ensure that the material is no longer distinctive where we can see each individual component, but that it's very homogeneous and we can see it very clearly. Now I go on to what is vermicomposting. And vermicomposting, hello, sorry. I see Barbara was talking there.
No, sorry about that.
Okay then. So we have vermicomposting, and what is vermicomposting? Vermicomposting is basically the biodegradation and stabilization of organic materials. So we mean that the material is what? Is being broken down and it's being stable. And I forgot to describe actually what stability is, because we're going to be referring to this term of composting as we go forward. Stability means that the compost kind of slow down in terms of breaking down. You ever watch something when you put it together and you're making it break down and you realize, okay, it's not changing anymore? No, it cannot be changing for two reasons. It cannot be changing because something is off, or two, it is finished. So when we speak about stability, we know that, listen, it's no longer undergoing heavy breakdown. And there are ways that we can test this. And one of the ways that we discussed a while ago for the compost is the temperature. We say we have a rising temperature after 24 hours, and then that temperature maintains, and then over time that temperature slowly drops. And when the temperature slowly drops, you generally have it there for a good little while, probably like 2-3 weeks after the temperature would have fallen, even up to a month or months, depending on how stable you want it. And that stability, in that curing and stable phase, what happens is that the microbes that are now there are no longer breaking down the easily accessible materials, you know. And what we call the easily accessible materials is like the glucose. Imagine the simple breakdown things, the things that can break down in your body very easily. Similar to the microorganisms, they have finished using that. What they would have gone to now is the more hard to break down things, like the lignin, the cellulose. So imagine that to be like your fiber that you eat. So they're now gone to that, and they will break that down slowly, and you wouldn't have any heat being generated. But over time, the material, the degradation of the material slows to a point where we can say that the material is now stable, and we can apply the material or use the material as we wish. Vermicomposting is very similar. The only difference is that we won't have the bulking. We introduce earthworms to the material. We have to ensure that the material, we soak the material and we leach. So if you're using manure, we have to ensure that we soak in it and we leach out the salts, because you know, or manure will have a lot of salts in it, and these salts can basically be toxic, as I spoke about salt earlier. So because the salt can burn the skin or affect organisms, the earthworms are also affected and they can die if the material is too salty. So generally you want to leach out the salts. Now the earthworms, because we're utilizing earthworms, you don't want any heat. So it's what we call mesophilic, or no heated conditions. So therefore the organisms that would be there helping the earthworms are organisms that don't generally generate heat. But how do we know that our vermicompost is ready? We had an image earlier, and I'll go back to it later on in the presentation. But if you look at the cast material that the vermicompost produce, you realize it almost looks like little rice grains. So these are earthworms. And the earthworms that we generally use in vermicompost are what we call EPIGEIC, E-P-I-G-E-I-C, for those of us who are interested. These are earthworms. They have different types of earthworms. And these are the earthworms that break down litter or organic matter, right? Waste or organic waste. Not all earthworms break down organic waste. Some earthworms actually only feed on the soil, you know, feed on soil and organic matter, but we need these type of earthworms, and they're generally sensitive to light. So they flicker a lot in light. And you will find them, let's say when you go to the farm and you go near manure, or like if you go in a very heavy litter area like a banana patch and you see something eating out your banana, if you see an earthworm in your banana or in the banana stem or eating out organic matter, you can say, okay, these are earthworms. You really only need 2 earthworms, and you want to collect them in the media that you get them in, but you really only need 2 earthworms to generate a population, because earthworms are hermaphrodites. So once you have 2, they will mate, and they will generally produce 2-3 cocoons, which is the eggs. And in the cocoons, depending on the species, you have 2 to 3 earthworms. So from 2 earthworms, you can get as much as 6 earthworms being formed, to 9, etc., depending on the species. These earthworms, as I said, they also reach sexual maturity. I won't get into that, but they feed on the organic waste. So they will feed on this. And when they feed on this, they have earthworms within their gut as well. And the they have microbes in their gut. And the microbes produce certain enzymes that helps to break down, let's say, the lignin, certain things, help to fight against the pathogen. So you see, unlike the thermophilic compost that the heat helps against the pathogens, in this one, generally the microbes in the gut of the earthworm and in the material helps to fight against the pathogen. So when the earthworm consumes the material, they excrete it. and they excrete it, and the material that is produced is known as a cast material. This cast material is basically this little rice grain pebble looking material. It's a very rich material. And what is beautiful about it is that because the earthworms have to process it, the material is already lower in comparison to the compost in salts. And generally, because again, you have to monitor moisture a bit more in this, it generally has a higher nitrogen, and some of the nutrients are very much in a higher concentration. But it's a more difficult process to manage. It means that you have to manage the type of waste that you put in. Like for example, those orange peels is a no-no, because the earthworms will generally run from that or don't want that, unless it's at a very high state of degradation. They would probably accept it. But it is a more difficult process to manage. But the end product, I would say, it's high in agronomic or high in you know, just gardening value. It has a higher value there. So the first thing is that when we add our earthworms to the material, let's say we leach out the salts in the material, or we place the materials there to slightly break down, because we want the material to be kind of soft so that the earthworms can eat it, because remember, they don't have any teeth or anything. So that's why they rely on the microorganisms to help break it down first, and then they move into the material. So they generally migrate into the material once it's ready for them and they want to eat it. And then they acclimatize in the material and they start to break it down in this initial phase. After which, they, you know, with the joint access or the joint process with the earthworms and the microbes and their guts, they have gizzards in their guts. The gizzard is like two things rubbing together. And these gizzards help to grind the material, and the earthworms help to break down the material until we end up with, a stable product known as vermicompost. Now we're going to speak about compost tea. And this is one of my favorite parts about making the compost. And I'll tell you why this is my favorite part about making the compost. Is that when we look at compost and vermicompost tea, it is basically a fermented liquid extract. And I'll show you how it is made. But basically, it's we take the compost and basically we ferment it in water at a particular ratio. Generally, the acceptable ratio is anywhere between 1 to 10, 1 to 20. For basic home gardeners, I will always encourage 1 to 20. It means 1 part. So same thing with our pigtail buckets. It don't have to be a pigtail bucket if we're not making that much. But 1 part of, let's say, compost to 20 parts of water. So if we utilize, let's say, a measuring cup, and we put 1 measuring cup of vermicompost or compost, we're putting 20 measuring cups of water, and we're steeping that. But we're not putting the compost directly into the water. We're putting it into almost like a crocus bag, saran netting, something that has holes, but the compost not gonna fall inside and have a lot of residue in the end. But what will happen is that that compost will steep in that water and ferment over time. And generally, we're looking at steeping it for anywhere over 3 days. I'd recommend 3 days, 3 to 7 days, depending on your liking. You know, you can experiment with it. But we have 2 types, non-aerated and we have aerated. What are the differences? In the non-aerated, let's say we're making some compost in a pigtail bucket. And we put the compost in the crocus bag and we tie it on the side. And we put the water inside there. In the non-aerated, we leave the cover open because we don't want to close the cover because air has to go inside. Because if you close, it's going to smell horrible. We're going to have certain things like the mosquito and all of these things breeding up inside of it. But what we mean by non-aerated, it means that we're barely aerating the material. We just have it there open. We might stir it now and then, but we're barely aerating it. Aerating, we can use like a fish pump, and non-aerated probably works better for you because of you don't need that much resources. Aerated, we probably have a fish pump, or we have to go manually, and we have to aerate it for a significant amount of time, like 15 minutes. And that aeration or non-aeration actually allows for the prolification of certain microbes over others. But both has been proven to work. And for home gardeners, nothing is wrong with using non-aerated. What do you require? You require a brewing vessel, which is basically like the pigtail bucket. You require the compost or the vermicompost. You require that filter bag that you're going to put it in. And you're just going to incubate it in that brewing vessel, which is in this case our pigtail bucket, for an extended period of time. So here's an image of what we will do. If you realize here we have our what? This is our nylon stocking. So you see they even use stocking here. They place the vermicompost, stable compost or vermicompost inside. When they place it inside, they have the water at the appropriate ratio. Here they're doing an aerated system. So they're aerating the tea, right? And after a while, you get something like this. If you realize it's very dark, it's no longer clear. So what happens is that we have now the characteristics, a lot of the characteristics of the compost here. So we have the microbes in the water. We have the nutrients being dissolved into the water. So can you imagine now utilizing this tea to water your plants? Utilizing this tea to combat plant diseases? If you think about it from a practical scale, you would have this little small bag of compost that can only probably grow around 1 or 2 plants. Versus this big tea or this liquid extract that you can spray now on what? A number of plants. You can have your spray bottle and you can root drench, or you can spray on the surface of the plants. So what you realize here is that compost tea or these liquid extracts are good ways to really extend because you know you go through a lot of work to make this compost. So you want to extend the applicability of it by utilizing the teas, you know, over a wider area to get benefits. So how do we manage our compost quality? In terms of the compost, as I said, we look at that temperature profile. Temperature rise and fall. And by looking at this temperature profile, this is a simple way we can look to monitor when our compost is finished or not. The next thing we have to look at is the change in odor and appearance. And I would have shown you in an image earlier how the compost changed from being very distinctive materials to being a very homogeneous product that looks almost like soil. So there's also a change in texture and a reduction in organic matter. And what do I mean by a reduction in organic matter? Remember I said there will be mass loss. So you start off with a very big pile and after a while the pile reduces less than half. So these are very basic ways in which you can monitor and say, okay, our compost is approaching a finished product or something that, you know, is finished at the end. Before I continue, I want to state something that a lot of home gardeners do that we want to be very mindful of. And what that is basically home gardeners have a tendency to just throw anything that they use out into the garden. And while on a micro scale or a minimal scale, you might not, a very small scale, you might not have any detrimental effects. On a large scale, let's say, for example, we just go to the farm and we get some manure. And we know that the manure have nutrients, we know that the manure have microbes, and we just apply it directly to our soil. We expect that our soil is supposed to be better. But when we applied unstabilized, remember I spoke about stable, not degrading anymore, cured, safe to use. When I mention stable, that's what I mean. When we have our unstable material like our cow manure that we just take from that the cow just, you know, just excrete and we take it and we use it in our garden, it can actually have negative effects in comparison to when we have our stable material. Let me explain why these negative effects will occur. Think about it. If we have, let's say, our fresh organic matter, remember we have our organisms inside there, which is our microbes. Now, microbes, like us, are selective. And sometimes they can utilize different forms. So I will tell you that microbes can utilize both organic and inorganic forms of nutrients. And I'm introducing new terms here, organic and inorganic forms of nutrients. Plants uptake only inorganic forms of nutrients. And what I mean by inorganic is mineralized or available forms of nutrients. All of us have nutrients. We as human beings have nutrients inside of us, locked in our tissues. But it's in an organic form. And because it's in an organic form, it is not accessible, let's say, to plants that basically utilize what? Inorganic forms of nutrients. For these organic forms of nutrients to be accessible to the plant, there's a process that is known as mineralization that the microbes facilitate that converts them from organic forms to inorganic, or what we would mention from henceforth, available forms of nutrients. And it is the available forms of nutrients that the plants can utilize. So when we apply something that is organic, the plants can't utilize the nutrients out of it immediately. They can only utilize the little available nutrients or inorganic nutrients that is available in the organic material. But after, it has to wait a while. So if we apply organic forms of nutrients or waste, what will happen is that the material will have to break down before it's of benefit to the plant. But there's something that occurs in this breakdown process that can be detrimental to your plants. I would say to you, for example, that the microbes, as I said, can utilize organic and inorganic forms of the nutrients. So just like us, I want you to imagine it like this. The microbes will generally convert the organic to inorganic forms. But let's say we apply the manure that have the microbes inside of it, and we applied some fertilizer that we buy from the gardening shop a week ago, and we applied the manure 1 week after. Because the manure is not cured or stabilized, as we defined earlier already, what is going to happen is that the microbes are going to utilize the inorganic forms that only the plant can uptake, because remember, the plant can uptake the organic forms. So the microbes are going to utilize the inorganic forms and rob the plant of nutrients. And then the nutrient the plant going to look sick and like have a depression or look as if like it have a deficiency. But the fault, what is happening there is that the microbes are utilizing the inorganic nitrogen in this case and robbing the plant of the inorganic or available form of nutrients. So I want you to think about it this way for those of you having a difficult time conceptualizing it. Think about, let's say, when you're home and you're hungry, and there are two options that you have. One, order pizza or KFC, or two, take out the chicken, thaw it out, season it, cook it. And for a lot of us, we will do the former, which is what? Take it out, order the thing and have it ready and eat it because it's available. But when we now have to go through this process to cook it and whatever, yes, it's more satisfying at the end, but you know, it takes a long time. So it's similar to the microorganisms. They want to do some work. But here what? When they come to do their work, they see the available nutrient that we apply in the soil from the garden shop fertilizer. It's not utilizing this. I don't want to utilize. I will break down the organic matter after. Laziness similarly to us. And I love to compare us to the microbes because, you know, I think they're magnificent in what they do or what they're able to do. So in that case, you can imagine that the microbes will be what? Utilizing the available nutrients, and therefore the plant will show deficiency symptoms. So what you want to apply, in essence, is stable organic matter. Material that is stable, that the microbes would have converted from organic to inorganic or available forms of nutrients, that when you apply it to the soil, the plant can uptake it readily. But because it's in an organic form, it won't just be available to the plant in massive amounts, you know. It's like a slow release. So it doesn't, you know, unlike your fertilizer that you buy at the garden shop where you have to apply it ever so often, when you use things like stable compost or organic matter, stable manure, what you really have there is something that will slowly introduce the nutrients over time to the plants. So therefore, you don't have to apply as often as you would like, right? So again, going on compost quality very quickly, is that if you set up a compost pile, as I described to you, how to set it up. And I will send you the video as well and some documents, read up documents and videos. If you have too much or too little moisture, and remember I was telling you this, that if we have too much moisture, generally it will what? It will drain out. But if you have too little as well, you will not have any rising temperatures within the first 1 to 3 days. And remember I said generally by 24 hours, you have temperatures above 50 degrees, 45 degrees Celsius, upwards of even 100. So if you don't see that within the first 1 to 3 days, especially in our thermophilic, not the one with the earthworms, something is wrong. It means that there's either too much nitrogen or there's either too much carbon. So we have to look at the moisture, we have to look at the ratio that we spoke about earlier, as well as pH. And it comes back again to why we need to measure pH at times. But pH is generally at from a minor standpoint, but it's the first two that are more important. When we see a sharp decline in temperature, like say within the first 3 days, the temperature just drop straight back to normal, it tells us a couple of things. It tells us that either our compost pile is too dry, or it tells us that there is excessive moisture in our compost pile. So we want to have, remember we said we want to have that temperature for a particular period to ensure the pathogen and weed kill. But what we want to have is, and it says here, if you have gradual decline, you have to constantly monitor the aeration and the moisture. If we have like an odor, like a strong ammonia odor coming from it that smells very pungent and very off, it tells us that there is some antibiosis, sorry, not antibiosis, some anoxic or anaerobic conditions, meaning that there are pockets in there that are just filled with water that are not getting moisture, which is why we want to rotate or turn our pile. And generally want to turn our pile, every day for the first, let's say for the first 3 days, we want to turn our pile every 3 days, for the first week, depending on what you're working with. And afterwards, we want to kind of extend that a little bit longer to probably every week and a half, every 2 weeks, depending on the type of compost system that you have. If it's an investor system and you make it, you can easily turn it. If not, you get to the shovel and you get to the fork and you turn it. If there's a decline in temperature with none of these limiting factors, we know that our compost is approaching what? Stability, which is very important. So what do we look for? Physically, we look for, again, as I said, that dirt-like material. We look for uniform particle and texture, and we also look for homogeneous end product. Physically, we look for a material that is free from inert material, free from viable weed seeds or most of our viable weed seeds, and compost generally holds a lot of water, generally 100 times its weight. So we know that when we have compost, we know that we can, minimize how often we water when we had compost and mulches to our soil, because these things will hold the moisture in our soil and reduce the amount of water that we'd have to apply to our soil, similar to mulches that we use to cover our soils. Chemically, which are things that we can't really see, we know that our compost, our stable compost, should have available nutrients, not organic, but available, which means that the plant can access it. The pH should be in an appropriate range. And this is where now compost plays a very important role, especially if we don't have a pH meter. Because of the nature of compost, and I won't get into it very complex, it has the ability to buffer pH. What we mean by buffer pH? It means that pH won't change drastically when we add certain things to our soil. It means that it's able to maintain the pH within a good range, a neutral, workable range that the plants can, obtain the nutrients, etc., that we discussed earlier. So compost helps with this when we amend our soils with compost. It is also rich in beneficial microorganisms, as I stated, and free from harmful pathogens, right? So what can we use compost for? We can use compost to directly supply micro and macronutrients for plant growth, right? We can utilize it to improve the soil structure. As I said to you earlier, it's used to hold water holding capacity. We can use it in our sandy soils to improve the structure of our sandy soils from allowing it to be free draining. Obviously, we don't want to add too much compost if we have clay soils. We want to minimize the amount of compost we add because we're just basically adding something that holds water on top of something that already holds water. So it's about managing and understanding the characteristics of these things that we're working with. It also increases the population of microbes, because remember, compost should have a lot of microbes, because microbes what broke down it in the first place. So it increases the microbes, and microbes can help in terms of making nutrients available. For example, some of us hear about nitrogen fixing bacteria. Some of us know about microorganisms that help to solubilize phosphorus. So microbes can help in terms of crop nutrition and can also help to antagonize and suppress plant diseases. I want to show you something, or bring your eye to something right here. If you look here, you have some tomato seedlings in this seedling tray. Here, for some of us who goes to the gardening shop, this is Pro-Mix that is commercially sold. And here, all of this is vermicompost, nothing added. I want to show you the importance of utilizing compost and vermicompost. If we utilize compost here, these seedlings would probably look worse than probably this. Because as I said to you, that the compost would have a high salt content. Because obviously we don't have any earthworms inside of it, any organisms that would be sensitive to the salt. So if we're utilizing compost, we want to probably mix it with the Pro-Mix to reduce the salt content. But what I want to highlight here is that the ProMix, if you're viewing the image, the ProMix seedlings are much smaller, sorry, yellow, kind of yellowing in terms of this, so you know that it doesn't have much nitrogen. In comparison to, let's say, the vermicompost, and this is 100% vermicompost that we're utilizing as seedling starters here. And if you look at this vermicompost, the seedlings look larger, healthier, and much more vigorous to be transplanted in our garden. So I'm just showing you how the importance of vermicompost and these amendments that we're making, how they can be used as seedling starter. And remember that this ProMix is, as I said, it's coming from what? These wetlands. They harvest it from underneath the wetlands. And this is not a renewable product. So over time, it will be depleted. The second thing is that you're purchasing this. And the third thing is that it barely have any nutrients. So you have to purchase fertilizers and stuff to even add to this. So it has an economic cost. Whereas now our waste has been transformed here to provide an all-in-one solution for our seedling starters. So we're recycling waste, managing our waste, and we are getting something that is productive in terms of giving us good seedlings to start with. Here, all we have is some perlite mixed with compost, and we applied compost tea to grow a plant to full development. Now, if our compost, I know some of us probably asking, suppose our compost is not stable, right? What is going to happen? Now I'm going to introduce you to another term. You remember I said stability means that it's not really degrading as much? Well, maturity means the effect that it has on the plant. Something can be stable, or a compost can be stable, means that it's not undergoing active degradation or very fast-paced degradation, but it is not mature, meaning that it has a negative effect on the plant. If it is mature, we're saying that it doesn't have a negative effect on the plant. What can cause it to have this negative effect? The salts, as we discussed earlier, the compounds. Remember, we were speaking about the lemon, the orange peel. The orange peel might have the acids that can turn it off and all of these different things. So we have to be mindful that even though we might have a stable compost, meaning that it's not degrading as much, it stopped losing mass, we're not seeing any heat, it might still be toxic to our plants, and we have to ensure that it is mature. And how to reduce this toxicity again is by not applying it in the solid form, but by probably utilizing the teas or the liquid extracts. This can reduce the toxicity if it is stable. Because remember, if you're diluting it like in a 1 to 20 in the teas, we're also diluting what? The salt concentration, etc. So teas is a form to make it a little bit more mature, palatable or acceptable for the plants that are growing. Here in our very mature compost, we see that it can be used as soil or peat-based container mixes. And we saw in the very mature one where we utilized what? The vermicompost directly. We didn't have to amend it or do anything. But we spoke about if we had compost that we would have to what? Amend it. So in that case, the compost versus the vermicompost would not be as mature. And as we know, depending on what we input, it will also dictate what the output would be like. So if we inputted something that was very high salt, that we never leach out the corn manure or the manures that we use in, it's going to have a high salt content in the end when it's stable, and it's going to be toxic to the plants. So we know that depending on the stage that it is at, we can utilize it for different things. So if you realize here that immature can be utilized for, land application, or we can have something that we compost, but it's immature, and we can utilize that or feed that to the vermicompost, to the earthworms in subsequent applications. What are some of the feedstocks that we can use? Animal manures, food waste, plant waste, sewage sludge. All of these different things can be composted. As a matter of fact, in some cases, I think in Washington, they're actually composting human bodies, persons who have passed away. That was a legislation that has gone. Human feces in some instances they're composting, but obviously that requires very high technical monitoring to ensure that it is safe, etc. We have different composting systems, and we spoke about vermicomposting and thermophilic composting. But even within these different composting systems, we have different methods and techniques that we can use. And I showed you two, like the in-vessel in the drum versus, let's say, the static composting, which is a pile. So before I continue, actually, let me just finish this off. And we're going to the last section of what we are completing today, the last 2 sections. But I want to tell you that when we are talking about here factors that affect the composting process. And if we're utilizing compost to provide what? Nutrients and to suppress diseases in the end, we know that the feedstock or the material that we use to make it is the first thing. The second thing is the composting system. And the third thing has to do with these quality indices. So we spoke about compost maturity, which has to do with how it affects the plant. We speak about stability, which has to do with the decomposition level. We spoke about these same physical, chemical, and biological attributes like the microorganisms, the nutrients, the loss of odor and the uniform look. And sometimes we can add inoculants or things to our compost as well. In terms of these, other things can affect also how effective our compost is at fertility and disease suppression. The aeration, remember we spoke about aerating our pile. When we spoke about our teas, we spoke about how long we had it fermenting, our ratios, and also what we utilize to mix it, or amendments that we utilize when we're mixing it. So I'll take a pause here for questions, Ms. Green, if there are any, before I enter this last phase of the lesson today, which is plant material selection, plant nutrition, and disease suppression, utilizing these amendments.
All right, yes, there are many questions. For now, I would say we can just go with 7 because we have 14 in total at present. So yes. The next comment comes from Oliver. He says, what I've noticed during the first year or so of gardening in virgin soil, I get good yields. However, after a few crop cycles, my yields have been less. I am now trying to rebuild my soil's fertility. I am happy for this information. I don't know if you want to comment to what Oliver said.
Sorry, yes, I would love to comment. Okay. Sorry, I stopped my video because I went to drink some water just now.
No problem.
Yes, but Oliver, what is happening there is depletion of nutrients over time. And I want to, again, I love to use the human analogy. If you go to the grocery to buy food, and we buy the quick food and we buy the foods that we have to cook and prepare, right? And the cook and prepare is like, we have to mix the fertilizer to apply the fertilizer. And the quick foods are like the cornflakes and all of these things, which is like the immediate food for the plant. Over time, both these food supplies will deplete. And because both of these food supplies will deplete, and it depends on the plant that you're growing. So like these things like, let's say, tomato, peppers, corn, heavy nitrogen users. So over time, they'll utilize a lot of these nutrients. And when they utilize a lot of these nutrients, what ends up happening is that your soil becomes bare, especially if you didn't give your soil enough time to build back its status, right? So, you give yourself time to work, to get an income, to go to the supermarket, to build back your groceries within your cupboard, within your refrigerator. And the soil needs that as well. It needs the ability to build back. And similar to how you have to physically go and, get these stuff, the soil you need to physically build it back by adding these stable organic amendments for some time. Doing some mixed cropping, like including, let's say, legumes. Because remember, legumes help because of the nitrogen fixing microorganisms. When we plant a lot of legumes or beans, it helps to reintroduce new nitrogen back into the soil. So we can do some mixed cropping to ensure that our soil isn't depleted. And lastly, we really want to reintroduce these nutrients so that, or leave our soils fallow for a little while, or leave that area. If we know that we're planting in that area over time, leave it for a little while, give it a little month, 2-month break, and go somewhere else and plant, or plant in a little container. So we need to have these fallow breaks, or we need to be constantly amending or introducing to our soils things that can build the fertility.
All right, thank you. Norris says that earthworms are beneficial to compost. Are there harmful organisms in compost?
Harmful organisms in compost. Generally, yes, there will be harmful organisms at the beginning of the composting process. Meaning that you don't know where you're getting your materials from. So you might have, let's say, some cow manure. And this particular cow manure might have, let's say, some pathogens inside there that might be harmful to the plants. Or let's say, for example, you cut your yard, or you cut the tomato plant, and you're going to put back the tomato plant in the compost. Remember, suppose you cut this tomato plant and this tomato plant had a disease on it. If the heat is not there, if the earthworms are not able to do what they're doing to stabilize the product, that's why we spoke about stability and maturity, what will happen is that this pathogen will still survive. And when you apply it back to the soil, you're reintroducing it back into the soil and to more of your plants. So what you have to do, as I said, this monitoring that I spoke about in the composting process and showing the heat and showing all of these things are critical to ensure that you have a safe product that basically it's almost free, or it's at a very low level of getting any adverse effects in the end.
All right. Thank you. We're now moving to Lennox. Lennox says, is chicken manure a good substitute for cow manure?
Chicken manure can be used, Lennox, but I will be honest with you. I'm not a fan of chicken manure for several reasons. One, the chickens that we grow in our Caribbean region, apart from the household things, have a lot of antibiotics. And there's a lot of arsenic. I don't know if any of you guys ever been near to a chicken farm or a chicken production place. For those of you guys in Trinidad, you probably would have gone to, if you go to Maloney near Arawak and stuff, you would often see this waste. And, you know, this dark color liquid extract as a waste. And these wastes normally are filled with arsenic, which is a heavy metal. As well as the fact that the chicken production process, chickens require antibiotics to be healthy, not to succumb to disease. So sometimes, or oftentimes, they inject, particularly in the wings, the chicken with these antibiotic compounds. And some of these antibiotics sometimes don't degrade and can be found in the chicken manure, which is a mixture of sawdust and manure. And therefore, for me personally, I'm not a fan of manure. It can be used. It is definitely a waste. But for home garden, if you can get a different manure, I will go for the different manure, because again, the chicken manure is generally very high in EC. Again, these antibiotics that remain inside of it and all of these other negative effects that you want to be very careful. If you're going to place it in our plants, you don't want this buildup of utilizing it constantly. Or even if you're utilizing it, don't utilize it constantly. Mix it up.
When you say different manure, are you referring to, for example, cow manure and the
cow
compost?
Manure, goat, sheep. Yes, cow manure, goat, sheep, rabbit, bat, all of these different type of manure waste.
Okay. The next one comes from Josephine. She's asking, is a container that cannot turn ideal for composting?
If you have a container that cannot turn, yes, it can be used for composting. And generally we call these static piles, or even in our in-vessel systems, we might have a pile that we don't have a turn mechanisms associated with it. In a case like that, I would say to you that these, you would have to turn out the material. So if it's in a drum, you ensure that though that the drum has holes to facilitate aeration, but you would have to take the material, even though it has holes in the drum, take it out of the drum and turn it manually with a fork or with a shovel, and then reintroduce it back into the drum. And this physical turning mechanisms ensure that there's proper aeration at the end.
So you're saying that it's not advisable to turn it in the container itself, it's best to take it out?
You can turn it into you can turn it in the container, but imagine utilizing a 55-gallon drum and utilizing a shovel to turn it. You won't turn it appropriately, and you'll still have these pockets, these pockets that don't have air. So to really get that space, that working space to really mix appropriately, it is better to take it out of the container. But let's say you're running, in a little emergency, you don't have the time to take it out and do all of that, and you want to just ensure that, okay, I'll do tomorrow and the next 2 days, you can do a little quick container turn until you're able to take it out and do the proper turning.
All right, now I have a question. I live in a concrete jungle in an apartment, and my planting will really be container planting. How will composting look for me? Do I compost in my apartment? And if I do that, will that attract insects and roaches?
So I'll tell you two things. The first thing that I'll say to you is that if you're in an apartment, the biggest thing that you probably can find to compost in is a pigtail bucket. The smallest thing that I'll recommend to use to compost in is half of a 55-gallon drum. So when you cut that drum in half, that is the smallest that I'll recommend to get that mass buildup. In a household, the most that you can do is a little bit of vermicomposting. And as I said, that's a little bit more complicated. What I would advise is, and nothing is wrong again with utilizing these fertilizer. What I would advise is to buy, well, I wouldn't even say buy compost, because a lot of the things that you have out there aren't really compost. That is the truth be told. But if you think about it, and you think about, you know, when I was reading the course outline for this course, one of the things that I think that would come out of it is the collective, of creating a farming collective and awareness. And these limits will always be there. But that is why we want to encourage community-based farming. Because where there are constraints, whether there it is land or etc. and all of these other things, if we have community-based farming, or if you engage, let's say, with a close friend that has, let's say, a property, and you said, guess what, I'm coming over there on Saturdays or whatever, and I'm helping you to make this compost. The compost can be made there. And you now can utilize the compost in your own apartment to make the tea. And you can utilize the tea or the compost. So I would tell you that it is difficult to utilize in an apartment, but if you have an open space, or if you want to start an initiative with your apartment colleagues, you know, to have a space to do such, you can do that to eliminate the challenges that you will have with that space.
Okay, so just confirming, if the option of going to a neighbor isn't present, you said use a pig pail for composting?
I would tell you to avoid composting within inside if you don't have it. If you can get a half 55-gallon drum, and let's say place it on the outside, if there's space to fit the half 55-gallon drum, because remember, you don't want to have this also inside. You want to have it in an outside space for your health too. So if you can find a space where you can put a half of a 55-gallon drum, then yes, proceed. If not, I will tell you to be on the safer side, engage a neighbor, or purchase it from a farm shop, or purchase alternatives.
All right, thank you. Moving on to the next one. It's from Azil or Miss Hoyt. She says, oh no, somebody was responding to Josephine. That person was saying that I think a container that cannot turn would be best for bokashi composting. This is an aerobic type of composting.
Right. So bokashi composting is basically anaerobic composting. So what it really does, in a quick terms, is basically utilizing anaerobic organism to actually make compost. There's several drawbacks with it, and it's a compost that is good for like fats and oils. And you see these skins that you were talking about, like the citrus skins and all of these, very difficult to break down things in general aerobic composting. Bokashi is very good at this. It's very good at breaking down these materials. But there are challenges with utilizing bokashi as there are with composting. But it is a method that you can utilize a pigtail bucket. So I affirm that suggestion that was given a while ago. But it's a little bit more complicated.
All right, thank you. The next one is Ms. Hoyt again, asking the 4-to-1 ratio for composting. Is it hot composting?
It's for both. Because remember, the same microbes are in the vermicompost. And the earthworms require carbon and nitrogen as well.
All right. Follow-up question is, okay, no, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that it would be for both of them, that ratio would be important for both in terms of establishing, because remember the microbes play an important role in both process. And I said that this is what the microbes require. So you'd have to ensure that it is there for both.
All right, a follow-up question of Ms. Hoyt. Also, what is the minimum size for a hot compost pile? Oh, yeah.
I would say if you can get bulking, similar to half of a 55-gallon drum. So you can visually think about a 55-gallon drum in terms of the size. For some of us who use as garbage containers, etc. In terms of the size, that volume and mass, well, not necessarily mass, but that volume is sufficient enough for hot compost to get heat developing.
All right, so the last one I'll do for this segment, I believe you would have mentioned it before, but you could always give a summary. Josephine is asking, how long does compost take to break down for the right use, and how do I know when it is ready?
All right. So if we utilize it in an investor system, it's a quicker system. So, for those of us who are really interested in composting, I would say, get some of our engineers, or, the persons who love to build. And as I said, I would send a design, an example, and build one that you can mix. Because in an investor system, stability can go anywhere by up to 3 weeks to a month. You can get something that is ready. If you're utilizing a static, and also the readiness is also depending on how small you would have ground it. You don't want to ground it too small, like sugar. But if you can get the particles down to pass through, let's say 2 inches, which is basically, if you want to measure 2 inches on your finger, that's the second mark on your finger, on your index finger. If you can get the material to pass through a sieve or be at least 2 inches or smaller, that is ideal. 3 inches works as well. But 2 inches and lower is ideal, and it also helps to increase stabilization time, meaning that it is quicker. But in an investor system, 3 weeks to a month. In a static system, you can have anywhere from a month upwards to 6 months, depending on the material that you're using and depending on the process and how big your pile is. So it varies, which is why I discussed the indicators that you have to look out for when monitoring this process, and to ensure that the process was set up properly.
All right, thank you. You may continue until the next question and answer segment.
Okay then. So thank you guys. I hope I'm not boring you. I know it's a very long session, and I know it's a very difficult thing to stay on a Zoom call for a long period of time. But I will try and wrap up very quickly within the next 30 minutes, this last section that I have here to go through.
Mr. Smith?
Yes?
With all the questions that are still coming in, I would say that your presentation is not boring.
Thank you very much, Ms. Green.
You're welcome.
So we have plant material selection. So, some of us love to go to garden store and buy our plants. We don't set our seeds by ourselves, right? So we go to the garden store and, sorry, let me turn on my video. So we go to the garden store and we purchase our seedlings, the plant in our household. Or we get some seeds and we put it on the windowsill and we plant it. So what should we look for when we're selecting a plant when we go to the garden shop? The first thing is that our plant should be free of disease, virus, and pests. If you go to the plant shop, check underneath the leaves. Check the top part of the leaves. Look at the plant carefully to see if it's a healthy plant. Because you know what you're doing there, if you never had that pest or that virus, and you, let's say, go to the garden shop and you see it on the plant and you bring it back to your home, you're introducing that virus or that pest to your other plants that you have there. So you want to ensure that your planting material is free of disease, virus, and pests. And you can physically evaluate these things. There should be no signs of nutrient deficiency. So when you look at the seedling, it's supposed to look green and healthy, right? You're not supposed to see it looking purple, dingy, yellow, crimply, no, right? It's supposed to have a dense root system. So when you take it out of the seedling tray, you're not supposed to see a little bit of root, or you're not supposed to see like piece of the root coming up and the rest of it staying inside. It tells you that the root system did not develop properly. And while you have a high survivability, yes, if you plant it with minimum roots, you want to ensure, especially if you're spending your money, that the root system of the seedlings that you're purchasing are well developed and well defined. Healthy, cream, to light brown in color and appearance. You want to ensure that there's a balance between root and shoot mass. So if you realize that the shoot very thick and healthy, but the root fine and coming like, nothing is there, it tells you something is off. Or if you realize that the root mass is very heavy or dense, but the shoot just not looking so healthy or looking so right, it tells you that something is off. Both has to look balanced and healthy. You want healthy, dark green leaves. Now, some plants naturally have light green leaves, and also you have to be mindful of very dark green leaves, because when you have very dark green leaves, it means that the person who is selling you, and when I say dark, very dark green, I mean that it is not characteristically green. It looks greener than what you normally expect when you watch the plant. If it's not a varietal effect or a cultivar effect, you have to be very mindful that this person probably has been applying a lot of nitrogen because it looks very dark green. And that if you bring it home and you apply even more nitrogen, that you will have a case where you can facilitate disease and pests to develop because there's an oversupply of the nutrient. You have to ensure that it has a sturdy stem and that it has a well-established shoot system. And the reason why I say this is because the shoot system, the leaves, etc., are important for photosynthesis, making food, helping in the growing. And the sturdy stem is obviously going to be important because you're going to be planting it outside, where it's going to be exposed to the elements. So your seedlings have to be slightly hardened off. And that is why when we plant seeds inside, we tend to bring it a little bit outside in partial sunlight, not in the full sunlight, in partial sunlight, so it can get a little bit hardy. So it can be exposed to the conditions, the environmental conditions, and improve its survivability. So I want to ask you a question. There are 4 images, right? I want to call this one here, for those of you guys are looking at the screen. This is the top left. Top right, bottom left, bottom right. I want to ask you, if you take up a seedling and you see these 4 images, top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, which one of them would you choose as the most ideal or the best seedling with the most ideal root system? So I'm going to ask you guys to input that in the chat, and I'm going to ask Miss Green to facilitate the responses.
All right, so Oliver says top left, as well as Le Powell. Ali says the same thing, as well as Kendra, Renee, Lady J, and myself. So we are all saying top left.
Excellent. Top left. The next question I want to ask is, why did you guys choose top left? If I can get just the first 3 responses as to why you guys selected the top left corner.
All right, so I'll be the first response. I said top left because it looks healthier than all the others.
Okay, what are the characteristics that you're looking at to determine that it looks healthier?
All right, so I'll let Lady J help me. She said it's most fibrous, and Oliver says it has a healthy root system, and L. Powell says it has the best root distribution.
I like that latter one, the last one that came out. I think it goes the closest. Everybody is correct, but it goes the closest in really identifying why the top left is the most ideal. I want you to look at a few things. In this root system, you have this main thick root, which is known as our tap root, or anchoring root, the root that really anchors the plant in the soil. And then you're looking at these very fine roots, which is what we call our fibrous or our adventitious roots. These are generally the roots that go to search for the nutrients and the water, etc. If you look here, this tap root has a kink, almost like a kink to the right-hand side. The plant will grow. If you look here, it has another kink, and sometimes this kink occurs here. Sorry, if you look here, you see another kink at the bottom, right, with this wrapping up here. These kinks often occur when we have root bound in a pot, like when we have a pot and the root can't move any further, there's no space, it changes the shape of the root. This root, if you look here, as the last participant said, lovely distribution. You have that tap root that maintains, that helps to anchor the plant, and you have these adventitious roots at the side that helps now in terms of nutrient and water, obtaining of water and nutrients for the plant. So yes, guys, you guys are correct, and I see that you guys are adept in terms of selecting a plant with a proper root system, right? So again, I go here, and I want to ask the question, do you think that, I wouldn't even look, right, it's not here, it's not here. I want to ask the question, do you think that a larger plant means a healthier plant? Because, you know, some of us, we associate big. So we go into the market and we see the big ginger. And because we see the big ginger, we think the big ginger better than the small maga ginger that we're seeing there. So I want to ask the question, do you think that big is better than small in terms of health, in terms of, you know, future productivity, in terms of just, you know, what we're looking for. Is bigger better? Ms. Green, can you facilitate the responses that, probably the first three responses that come up?
Sure. So the first two are saying no, and the final one from Josephine is saying no, because it could be that there is more chemical.
Okay then. So there are factors, yes, that affect the size of something. But let me ask you something. If some of us would have planted some things and we see this long stem coming out, correct? We see this long extension of stem coming out, and that is what we know as etoilation, when the plant is searching for light, meaning that we sow the seed, but there's not much light, or even when the seed is mature, there's not much light, so there's this long stretch for light, and the plant looks bigger, but that doesn't mean that it's healthier. So there are a lot of factors that we have to look for to ensure that our plants are healthier. Now, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plants here. You are looking at these plants coming out of a seedling tray, right? If you look at these plants, you see the root in the promix, correct? You see the stem, right? And you see the leaf distribution. I want to ask you, this is plant A, plant B, C, D, E. As a matter of fact, plant 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Out of plant 1, starting from the left, to plant 5, to the right, which one of these plants would you identify as the most ideal plant that you would select for planting if you only needed one?
All right, I would say 2. Josephine agrees with me, and Sharita says 3, plant 3. And Kendra says plant 4. So we have 3 different responses. Some say 2, some say 3, some say 4, and one person says 1.
All right, excellent. So I like the mixture and views. And this is beautiful because it shows us that, you know, we are all subjective in what we think is good, what we think is excellent, you know, and what we accept, you know. So each of us have our different standards in terms of what we accept, and that is fine. We have minimum standards, because the truth be told is that all of these plants, if we were supposed to plant them, would grow. But what I would like to ask you, let us start from 1. The respondent that said 1, can I ask you guys, and the others can formulate their opinions to submit in the chat. Why would you choose 1? And your answer doesn't have to be right or wrong. I just want to know, what is your perspective? Why did you select 1?
All right, Mr. Smith, I'm going to allow Lady J to answer, so you could hear another voice besides mine.
Excellent.
Lady J, just hold on so that I could get your mic unmuted. All right, go ahead, Lady J.
Good morning. I was looking at the root structure, the fact that I could see the white of the root. That's why I was thinking either 1 or 4.
Did you hear Mr. Smith?
I didn't hear it properly, so I'm not sure if you could repeat for me. It sounded
okay, Lady J, could you repeat, please, a bit louder? You sound a bit far.
Oh, I said I was thinking of 1 or 4 because of the root structure.
You were thinking about 1?
1 or 4 because of the root structure.
Because of the root structure. All right. Okay. Fair enough. Excellent. No problem. Can I hear 2? Somebody said 2, right? I think
yes. Hold on. So Azil, or Adiel, my apologies. Let me unmute your mic so that you can respond to Mr. Smith. All right, go ahead.
Okay, I was saying 2 because the roots look good and there are a good amount of leaves, and also the stem is thicker than the others.
So I see that one of the most defining things for you was the stem thickness, right? Because some of others have roots as well and leaves, but you said this because of the stem thickness you selected. Okay, fair enough. Thank you. What about 3? I think someone said 3. Did someone say 3?
Yes, Sharita said 3, so let me get her. All right, Sharita, you can go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Sharita.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, for me, it was between 3 and 4, but 4 because of the root bed. However, I find that the plant itself is too tall, it's too mature. The number 3 has just the right amount of leaves. The stem looks healthy. It still has enough root that I know that you should be able to pull it out of the seedling tray without it being torn up. So I think I chose 3 because of the, just the height of the plant, the healthiness of the leaves, and it has enough root on it that it would come out of the tray without breaking up.
Excellent, excellent. All right, and can I have the last one for 4? I think that was the last selection.
All right, for 4, let me see. Let me go with Kendra. Kendra said 4, so let me get her. All right, Kendra, you may speak.
Yes, hi. I chose 4 because of the, let's say the ratio between the root section and the shoot is about 2 to 1. And also the roots are just evenly, you can clearly see them throughout the soil that's there. It look abundant and well distributed, to use the word before.
Excellent. So thank you very much, everyone, for participating in this exercise, right? I know it's sometimes very difficult, in a Zoom session again, because it's boring, you're just listening. So I believe in the participation, and I try as much to engage the participation, and I appreciate the responses. There is something I want to highlight in the responses, though, that there are key things that allow each of us to make a selection, and that is how we are in life. There are key things that allow us to make a decision. We're making a big move. Should we go to university? No. Should we take up this new job? We look at key things, location, many different things. And at that time, it is what matters to us the most, as well as what we are exposed to. So, as our colleagues would have said, some persons said 1, some persons said 2, 3, and 4. Now, for me personally, I would select 4. Does that mean that 1, 2, and 3 would not grow if I selected these seedlings? No. Yes. No, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't grow. They will all grow. But the reason why I would select 4 is similar to what who was the last person again, Miss Green? Sorry. Well,
Hi, sorry. The last person was Aziel.
Aziel. So similar to what Aziel would have mentioned, if you look among all the roots here from this ProMix right here, you would realize that plant 5 have the least amount of roots. You're not really seeing it developed. You're seeing roots, yes, in the other 3, but the most developed root system is really plant 4, right? So that's the first indicator. So it means that because the roots are developed, when I am lifting my seedling out of the tray, I'm not going to get this crumbling that I'm seeing here, or this crumbling or loss of, let's say, the media, because the roots would not have been properly developed, right? Or it means that when I'm pulling out the plant, the roots will not come out without the media. The second thing I would say is that if you look here, the big difference, both of them have leaves, both the leaves look healthy, both kind of curving towards the light. But if you look below here, this one has a better root system. So for me, if I am supposed to select between these 2, I will still select 4 because of the better root system over 2. The next thing that I would like to show you is that I personally believe in that evenness of the shoot. So if you look here, to me, the shoot looks a little bit more even than this one. The second thing in comparison to, let's say, plant 1, 3, and 5, plant 2 and 4 has what? Very thick stems. So this tells me something in comparison to, let's say, to plant 3, that yes, has a good root system that is somewhat developing, but the stem is not as thick as plant 4 and plant 2. So that tells me that, hey, this plant probably could do with a little bit more hardening before I place it in the soil out in the backyard. That, I could allow the stem to get a little bit thicker so that it's hardened and more able to withstand some of the environmental harshness that may arise when I place this plant outside or plant this plant outside. All right? So I hope that's very clear, but I want to also reiterate that there is no wrong answer, and that was the first thing that I mentioned in the overview, that, you know, there's no wrong answer in gardening, just many experimentation until you get it right. So quickly, I'll go over nutrients because I did this in the beginning, which is that nitrogen, we spoke about the macronutrients or the major nutrients. So we have 3 major nutrients and 2 secondary macronutrients. The 3 major nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And remember I said they are represented as N, P, and K. And remember I said when you go to the gardening shop and you see those 3 ratios, generally the macronutrients are mentioned like 20, colon 20, colon 20, and then you see plus magnesium, plus calcium, plus zinc, plus this. So you would see the plus to mean the micronutrients. But generally when you see the colon, it is representing these 3 macronutrients that we have here. So it says that nitrogen is generally used to promote what? Leaf growth, the chlorophyll development, right? And helps to convert plant, it helps in terms of the process of plant making food, right? So that's what nitrogen is very important from. So we know if you plant a lot of green vegetable-based plants, leafy vegetables, we know that we need to have something that has a good bit of nitrogen. Phosphorus supports vigorous development of roots, stems, blossoms, and fruits. So we know that phosphorus is very integral for 2 particular stages of our plant development. That being root development or initial germination and root establishment, as well as blossoming and fruiting during the latter stage of planting if we have a fruiting crop. The last macronutrient that I'll discuss here is potassium. And that plays a key role in helping plants to digest and manufacture their food, which ultimately aids in terms of increasing yields. So what you'd realize is that when you reach to that yield component of your plants, particularly if you have things like tomatoes, peppers, etc., we want to ensure that phosphorus and potassium are in relatively higher proportions than nitrogen. However, at the beginning stage of our plants, we want to ensure that nitrogen and phosphorus are in relatively higher concentrations than the potassium. Or for those of us who can't discern or differentiate the difference, equal ratio fertilizer would work, such as a 20, 20, 20, which is what a lot of us buy when we go. You ever see that blue salt or Nutrex? That is a 20, 20, 20, which means that it's equal proportions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Or secondary nutrients or secondary macronutrients, meaning that they're not as major as these 3 here, but they're very important, are calcium, magnesium, and to a lesser extent, sulfur. But calcium and magnesium is very important, particularly in the flowering and fruiting stage. And I'll discuss this a little bit further. I'll give you an example with visuals when I move forward. We also have our micronutrients. And, you know, that is why we take our multivitamins, because at the end of the day, we get most of these things, you know, as humans when we eat our general meals. But what we don't possibly get is some of these micronutrients, which is why we will take like multivitamins and these other additives to ensure that we have our minimal supplements of these micronutrients. Similarly, our plants require these micronutrients to carry out their functions. Now, if you're planting in a medium, let's say pro-mix, etc., we have to ensure that we introduce this, especially if we're doing potting plants. We have to ensure that we have the micronutrients. We don't require a lot of it. That's why we call it micro in comparison to the macro. However, in our soils generally, we generally have enough micronutrients to supply this. So generally, when we're looking at basic gardening, we're really focused on our major macronutrients, NPK, and these 2 secondary macronutrients, which is calcium and magnesium. So we want to look at fertilizers that have these and probably buy them for different stages of our plant growth as we just discussed. We also have organic versus inorganic fertilizers. Are inorganic fertilizers bad? I want to say no. I would like to tell you that inorganic fertilizers aren't necessarily bad because they do come from natural sources. For example, they come from phosphate rocks. Limestone come from calcium carbonate, like limestone rocks, like in Barbados, in Antigua, these places. So they come from natural sources. The challenge with inorganic fertilizers is that they have to be processed. which means that you are depleting a natural source that probably, in most cases, cannot replenish itself in a sustainable manner. So nothing is wrong with inorganic fertilizers, but you have to bear that in mind and say, if we can introduce organic fertilizer to reduce the amount of inorganic fertilizer we purchased, or if we're environmentalists or concerned about the environment, how much of these things we use, if we can utilize these reuse materials or these organic materials, it tells us that we can have a balanced plant nutrition. So some examples of organic fertilizers include compost, vermicompost, and their teas, as we discussed, stable manures, and in some of the things that we're not used to, seaweed extracts. And I'll be cautioning saying seaweed extracts because you can't take seaweed and just apply it to the plant. Seaweed extracts does something that is very unique, which is that it boosts the plant immune system. It's like you taking, for those of us who know Codal or Ferrol or these boosters, like echinacea and all of these things. The seaweed extract, is like that. So, and you have to be mindful of the salt and all of these things in terms of when you're making these seaweed extracts to boost fertility. Right, but these are organic forms. The bone meals, when you have the bone meals like with the eggshells and with the bones to provide calcium, all of these things are organic applications of fertilizers. And obviously we can buy our inorganic fertilizers that can be fertilizer blends, or it can be soil fertilizers. So a fertilizer blend is that same Nutrex or growing salt, which is the blue one. It's an MPK, it's a blend because it has a blend of different nutrients. But we can buy a single nutrient formulation, which will have probably like nitrogen alone, like if you buy urea or ammonium nitrate. That is just a strictly nitrogen fertilizer. So if we're only concerned with a particular aspect of our plant, or we know that the other nutrients are well balanced, we don't necessarily have to buy a multi-nutrient formula, because we will be oversupplying the other nutrients and probably creating toxicity in some instances, right? So we have two major types. We have the granular and we have foliar fertilizers. Granular fertilizers are generally these grains that we would generally apply, like the same grain salt we generally apply on our plants. Now, there are different application methods, and I'll discuss these three major ones. We have broadcast application, which you home gardeners wouldn't generally use. But in a large scale field, they will generally have a broadcaster that broadcasts these granular fertilizer food to the soil, on a large scale, like the lawns, etc. You would have these broadcast application. We then have top dress application and side dress application. Top dress is basically looking like a round, like a band application, like around the plant. And the side dress is basically to the side of the plant. And when we're applying these granular fertilizers, we want to apply very little. And people underestimate how little we apply. Like when I say little, I mean, I don't want to give you an exact figure, but in most instances, depending on the nutrient status of our soil, sometimes 6 to 10 grains around each individual plant. Very little, 6 grains, 6 of the small pebbles, etc. around each of our plants. So it's not a lot, because if you apply a lot, we end up with soil toxicity, and we start to see tick burning, where our plants start to burn, right? I will also say that when we're applying fertilizers, we apply it at the drip zone. What is the drip zone? Our plants extend outwards because of the leaves, right? It grows upwards and extends outwards. The drip zone is basically that zone to which the leaves extend to. So you're looking at that circular circumference to how far the leaves move to. And the reason why you normally look at this, like if you look at a big tree and you see the canopy of the tree extending outwards, generally gives you an indication that the roots have extended underneath as far as how the canopy would have extended. And therefore, remember I said that the adventitious roots are the ones that search for nutrients and water. It means that these adventitious roots will be out to that zone of the canopy. And therefore, that is where you would want to apply the fertilizer for immediate accessibility and usage. We also have water-soluble fertilizers, and these are fertilizers basically like our Nutrex, etc., that we will mix in water and we apply. We can apply them two ways. We can apply them utilizing, foliar and soil drench. What is a soil drench? A soil drench is when we drench the soil and the roots. This method gives plant directly to the soil, But especially when we have container gardening, we want to be very careful of how much we soil drench, because unlike a soil that has unlimited dimensions in most cases, our container is within a limited dimension, which means that the more you fertilize in the media, not knowing how much you're fertilizing, not recognizing that you're over fertilizing, you will end up have a buildup of salts in this limited contained container, right? In this limited container containing soil. So you want to be very mindful of how much of these soil drench that you do when you have container, because you might have a buildup of toxicity, fixing of nutrients, etc. In comparison, plants can obtain nutrients from the leaves. Yes, you can spray plants on the foliar and they obtain nutrients. As a matter of fact, the response when you spray plants on the leaves is much quicker than when you apply in the soil. And if we are worried about, let's say, EC, or we don't know that we applied some to the soil and we don't really want to make it too salty, and we think that the plant might need a little bit of nutrients, we can try out the foliar to see if there is any change visually in the plant in terms of its nutrient status. There are a couple of things that we want to avoid when we're applying certain foliar applications or these liquid fertilizers. And pesticides, it applies the same way. We want to avoid applying these things in windy or rainy days. So we want to choose times when the wind is very still. This can cause the fertilizer to be misplaced and ineffective, and in some cases can be harmful because it moves to other places, like it can move to the rivers, cause eutrophication, buildup of algae, and all of these different things. When using granular fertilizer, always be sure to knock off plants to avoid burn. So meaning that you don't want the fertilizer to land on the plant. Some of us, we use the fertilizer, we just throw it on the plant. The plant will get burnt, right? Because of the high salt content. So we don't want that. Similarly, like how if we drink hot tea, or if we taste something very hot, it might scorch our tongue, we don't want that to happen to our plants. Never apply granular fertilizer when the soil is extremely dry. Again, if it's granular, it needs to dissolve so that the nutrients become available. Because remember, the plant obtains nutrients in the bulk soil solution. So if the soil is dry, we have to water it to prevent plant burn or that toxic concentration of these salts that the plant require for growing. So I asked a question earlier, does big mean better? And here we see two very healthy tomato plants that one is taller than the other, but that doesn't mean that one is better than the other. There can be varietal differences as well as conditional differences that allows it to be different size. But by looking at key things, such as, let's say, the stem thickness, the leaf, looking for pest and disease, the greenness of the plant, the root systems, we can discern that both plants are healthy despite the differences in size. So we're moving into the latter phase of our presentation for today, which is basically identifying deficiencies on plant. And the plant that I've chose visually to utilize in this lesson today is tomato. And the reason why I utilize tomato, because I love to call it a model crop. We use it in research a lot. We use, home gardeners are used to it. It's a plant that we are used to. We know, we recognize tomato when we see it. So therefore, even though some of these nutrients might express themselves differently in other plants, generally, these symptoms are typically seen throughout different plants. I also want to mention that these symptoms are not exclusive to only nutrient deficiency, that other things might be happening to your plants, but these things become easier to discern over time and with experience. Based on, what you use to solve it, you might have an idea that, okay, it was definitely this when I saw it the last time. So again, experience makes the difference over time. Nitrogen deficiency. When we have nitrogen deficiency, we generally have yellow or lighter green leaves, while the veins of the plant remain green. So the veins, which is the veins here, remain green, but the leaves turn yellow, and that's what we're seeing here. Generally, we have that yellow look. We know that is nitrogen deficiency, or what we call chlorosis. But I would like to burst that balloon and say that generally this chlorosis is also found on things like iron deficiency, zinc deficiency, other deficiencies. But again, remember I said that we're generally gonna have micronutrient deficiencies, as well as the stage or where these deficiencies occur will differ. So like I think for zinc, it will occur at the tip. So you only see it at the new growth, that chlorosis. Whereas this, you might see it on all of the leaves throughout the plant. So this is generally how we can identify nitrogen deficiency, which is one of the major deficiencies. And we can know if there's nitrogen oversupply if the plant looks extremely dark green. Phosphorus deficiency is also another major deficiency, because phosphorus is a nutrient that becomes very fixed when we add it to the soil and is very sensitive to pH. What we generally see when we have phosphorus deficiency is these purple tinged leaves. So for those of us, if it's not a varietal color effect, if we see the purple leaves or this purple color developing on our plant or on our leaves, it is telling us that our plant has phosphorus deficiency. And typically, when you see this purple symptom or colors developing, it is telling us that phosphorus deficiency is even at later stage, because for this color because you can't really detect when phosphorus is deficient in early stages, because there's nothing that shows. But when you see this purple color, this purple violet color or bluish color, it tells us that there is severe phosphorus deficiency, and therefore we need to apply a fertilizer with phosphorus, because the plants will look stunted and they will have this purple bluish violet tinged leaves. Now, potassium deficiency, as you can see, you're seeing the yellowing, but the yellowing is particularly seen at the edges of the leaves. So what you would see for potassium deficiency is that around the edges of leaves, you will see almost that browning or that yellowing as you're seeing here. That yellowing and browning, remember in nitrogen, you're seeing the whole entire leaf yellow, and the veins, main vein remaining green. In phosphorus, you're seeing the leaves turn that purple tinge. Now in potassium, what you're seeing is the edges of the leaves turning brown. When you see this, it is an indication that here we're having some potassium deficiency here. Before I go further into the other nutrients, I want to highlight something that is very keen in discerning whether you're having a disease problem or whether you're having a nutrient problem. Nutrient problem has to do with what? The status of the soil or the growing medium. So if we're having a nutrient deficiency, typically we expect to see it across all of our crops, especially if we have the same crops growing there, we expect to see that symptom across all our crops. If we have a disease problem, you might not see it across all of your crops. You might see it on one crop, and then it slowly take over that crop, and then it move to another crop, and then it move to another crop. So there's slow progression or movement in the field or in the garden when there's a disease problem. So the reason why I'm mentioning that, because there's some fungal disease that you might see this browning. But one of the easiest way to know, okay, is this a nutrient or is this a disease, is that if it's a disease, you know that you will see it on one plant, but you're not seeing it on the other plant, but both of them plant close to each other. So it can't be that this part of the soil may have no potassium and that part has potassium. That will give you an idea, okay, probably it's a disease, or probably it's something else. But if you're looking along the garden and you're seeing this characteristic throughout your garden, and more so, even if you've seen it in more plants, it tells you concretely that, hey, this is a nutrient problem. All right, so remember, potassium, the browning on the edges. Then we have calcium deficiency. And I'm sure some of you guys in the home garden have planted tomato, and you see this tomato blossoming rot. Any of you guys ever plant tomato and see this? You can just indicate in the chat. I'm very curious to know. I think it's a thing that a lot of home gardeners experience. So when you have calcium deficiency, one of the first things you see on the growing part of the plant is that you see tip die back. So you see that growing tip on the tomato plant or any plant, you just start to see it wilt, or you just start to see it die, like wilt like this and just die. When you see that tip, which is that new, like the new leaves, the new small leaves coming out, when you see those tips that start to die, it tells you that there is calcium deficiency. Another thing that I would like to make very noticeable here, as I'm going on to this image here, is that nutrient moves to the plant or is uptaken by the plant in different mechanisms, whether it be by diffusion, by root intersection, by transpiration pull, mean that the root have to touch it, mean that diffusion in water, you understand? Or it means that transpiration means that it is pulled. Transpiration is basically, has to do with evapotranspiration, when sun is shining on the plant. So therefore the plant will what? Transpire. It's almost like respiring. It's almost like it's losing sweat. So it's like it is pulling things out of the plant. So basically it's pulling the moisture or the liquid solution from the roots through the from the soil, sorry, through the roots, up through the stem, to the leaves, and then in the leaves where you have the pores and the stomatas, there is respiration occurring. That is transpiration pull. Now, if you have your plants indoor without any sunlight at all, which is why sunlight is very important, you're going to have a problem with some nutrients like calcium, magnesium that moves through transpiration pull. Meaning that if it's not outside, even if you have calcium in the soil, you will still have deficiencies because the sun is not there to help with that transpiration pull to move the calcium throughout the plant. And you can see things like this. So this can occur because of two things, because of that same movement of the nutrients throughout the plant, because it's not in the intermittent sunlight to allow for transpiration pull for the nutrient to move throughout the plant, or it can occur because there's a deficiency of the calcium in the plant. But generally, if we have calcium deficiency in our fruit, which is why I say calcium is very important for fruit development, we will have, particularly on tomatoes, this thing that we know as blossom end rot. Our next thing is our secondary macronutrient, our second secondary macronutrient, which is magnesium. And how we know when we have a magnesium deficiency is that we see yellowing, chlorotic symptoms, or mottled chlorotic symptoms inside of the leaf. You realize it's not in the vein, but it's within the little surfaces of the leaf. So we're seeing those dead spots, which can also be bacteria or a fungus. That's why I'm saying that some of these things over-relate. But what is characteristic is that we're seeing this mottling, this yellow mottling on the leaf. And if I recap of everything that I've shown yellowness so far, we know that what the nitrogen shows what yellowness, what is within the leaf, and what is the vein gets is still green. Magnesium, you're seeing this mottling, and calcium, you're seeing that dye back on the tips, and potassium, you're seeing the browning on the edges. So there are different things, and over time, as I said, you become more familiar with that. So that is how we will diagnose these major macronutrients that are more important when we visually look at it. And that is why I was telling you that we might not be able to test the fertility of our soil, but there are visible cues that we can use to really tell the nutrient status of our soil, and by extension, the crop nutrition or plant nutrition profile, and if our plants are healthy and if they will give us good yield. The last thing that I will go over right now is the mechanisms involved in suppression. Now, yes, plants can, compost, vermicompost, and their teas can help with suppression. How do they help with suppression? These same microbes, which is why we want to encourage these beneficial microbes. In most instances, the suppressions are biological, as I said, and by action of the microbes. And even if it is chemical, generally the chemical attributes or the chemical mechanism comes about because of the microbes producing some chemical compound. And I will give you the first example here, which is antibiosis. Don't be fooled by the large word or the big word. It simply means a microorganism is capable of producing a secondary metabolite, or let me use an even simpler word or a more common word, the microorganism is capable of producing antibiotics. And this antibiotic can affect another organism that may be harmful. Let me give you a practical example on this. One of the antibiotics that we utilize is what? Penicillin. And that comes from a fungus, right? And if you think about it, penicillin has been used, and if you didn't have penicillin, a lot of us would succumb to a lot of the different diseases, bacterial diseases in particular, that affect us as human beings. Penicillin was isolated from a fungus, from a microorganism, and it was tested not to be cytotoxic to the human being, but to suppress these bacteria that can cause harmful effects in our human bodies. Similarly, metabolites can be produced by some of these good microorganisms in these composts, and they can produce antibiotics that suppress or kill these same pathogens that I believe one of the participants was speaking about earlier. So it can attack these things. I don't have an image here, but I forgot to place it in to show you, like in a plate. If I plated a pathogen, a plant pathogen, and I treat it with a microorganism beside of it, you'd realize that the pathogen is growing in the opposite direction and not growing close to the microorganism, because the microorganism is producing that antibiotic. So here we have a little nice demonstration here of how antibiosis take place. Here we have this pathogen called Pythium Pythium species. Now, Pythium is what causes damping off. For those of you guys who are familiar with, let's say, nursery production, etc., that damping off is generally to occur in seedlings. When you see that plant just start to wilt, you don't know what happened. You just see this black necrosis at the soil zone, and you're just seeing the plant just wilting and dying. So it's a soil-borne humicidity or pathogen. And imagine this is the root surface. So imagine this is your root right here. Imagine this is a piece of your adventitious root. This is the Pythium, and the zoospore is a asexual spore. This is the flagella. So this is what allows the spore that comes from the plant pathogen to swim in the soil solution. So the pathogen is at a nice mature stage, sexual maturity. It releases the zoospore. The zoospore swims, and based on the chemicals that are produced, same like how them love say mosquito love come to you and bite us. Based on, with sweetness or with skin, mosquito bite us. There are certain chemicals that are produced by the roots that are attract these plant pathogens that are species specific. This plant pathogen swims, and when it swims, it attaches itself to the root. And when it attaches itself to the root, before it attaches itself to the root, because we use our compost introduced this particular microorganism called Bacillus subtilis. This bacillus, right? It primed. You remember microorganisms reproduce. This bacillus prime. It's in the root. It's in the soil zone, and it's also on the root, right? It's around the root. But this bacillus produces this antibiotic here, and this antibiotic now comes and kills the Pythium, preventing the Pythium from causing the disease or infecting or coming up. Because what will happen is that this Pythium will now come on the root. It will almost like acid burn the root surface, penetrate within, start to germinate within the root, and then it starts to block the xylem and the flow, which is the vascular bundles that allow for water and food to move. So imagine that to be like your arteries. It starts to block your arteries and all of these different things until it blocks it so much to the point where the plant collapses and then dies. So if we have now this microorganism that produces this antibiotic, it prevents this, because this antibiotic kills this and it prevents it from causing an infection. So that's the first way in which it provides suppression, antibiosis. The second way is that when we have all of these microbes again, that is why the microbes are very important. Healthy microbes equal healthy soil. We can have competition for nutrients. And what does that mean? It means that when we have, let's say, a couple microorganisms, beneficial microorganisms from the compost, and let's say we have that same Pythium, and that Pythium now requires nutrients to also carry out its function, similarly to the microorganisms. Remember we spoke about carbon and nitrogen that the microorganisms require? What is going to happen here is that because there's so much of these beneficial microbes, because you added it from the compost, this oversurge of supply, it will outcompete the pathogen for nutrients that the pathogen requires to live and survive. Similarly, imagine if there's only one of you, and let's say you're in a classroom with about, how much of us in this session today? Probably 59 thereabout. What is going to happen eventually is that if you have one person wanting this food and 50 other persons sit at one slice of pizza, don't you have a lesser chance to get that slice of pizza in comparison to the other 50 persons? So that's the same thing that is happening here. So you now will eventually starve and feel hunger. And in this case, the pathogen will starve and die. So here we have, again, this is the nutrient here, linoleic acid. This is the pathogen, sporangium, Pythium, right? What happens is that this microorganism it utilizes all of the linoleic acid that the Pythium would need, which is the pathogen would need to cause infection on the cucumber. And therefore, it kills or prevents the Pythium, the pathogen, from causing an infection. We move on to the last two. Now, we have parasitism or predation. What happens in parasitism or predation? Generally ascribed to fungus in the compost. They generally move or detect through chemicals, they attach and then degrade, almost like acid. They degrade the cell wall. Now, when they degrade the cell wall, let's say, for example, this is our fungus here, trichoderma. Now, let's say this is our pathogen, Pythium here, and this is Pythium all the way here. Imagine this is Pythium. The trichoderma, which is our fungus that is found in the compost, will now attach itself based on chemical recognition to the harmful pathogen that can affect our crop. And what is known is it will lytic, almost like hydrolyze the pathogen, almost like acid, and burn it. And by burn it, you see it here, it's attached and burn. And then because it burns, it creates an opening for the cell, everything to come out. It's just like, for example, people getting a stab wound or a gunshot wound. In a case like that, the trichoderma does that similar thing and prevents the pathogen from harming. As well, we can also create our plants to be more suppressive if we improve our nutrition and vigor, meaning that we improve the nutrition and vigor based on the nutrients of our plants. Obviously, similarly to us, just like how we take the vitamin C, you realize how they have the COVID-19 going around, and some of us eating our garlic or honey or vitamin C, taking our boosters, because we want to be in what? Or we want to not have certain nutrients lacking. It's a similar thing here. We don't want to have certain nutrients lacking. We want to prime the plant so that it's ready, or the defense system is ready to fend off any disease that comes. The last one that I'll discuss is induced systematic resistance. And this sounds very complex, but it's basically induced protection. So these microbes, these beneficial microbes, what will happen is that they go like a rum. So in this case, Pseudomonas is the beneficial microbes. It goes around the root, because remember, we're applying the compost in the soil or in the tea. So it goes around the root and kind of prime the roots. When it goes around the root, it sends a particular signal in the plant. Imagine this being like taking vitamin C. And what it does is that it sends that signal to the plant, and by sending the signal to the plant automatically boosts its immune system. Like it says, yes, I'm primed, I'm ready to protect against anything. And because it boosts the defense system, because a plant doesn't have an immune system, so it doesn't remember past diseases, it just has a defense system. This boosted immune system prevents the sporangium from attacking. So examples of a boosted immune system will be like the plant will become very have a lot of lignin. So basically the stem will become very thick. So obviously the pathogen can't penetrate it a little bit as easily. These are mechanisms that occur when we have induced defense or resistance. Most times the suppression is general, meaning that all of these, a combination of these mechanisms occur, which is like the suppression, the antibiotics, the competition for nutrients, all of them occur, and that is what causes the disease to be suppressed. That is the end of the presentation. I know it was a very long presentation, but I hope it was fruitful, and I hope that you guys had, there was something that you could take away. I hope it answered a couple of the questions that you guys had, and I hope that your capacity has been built in terms of your experimental capacity to go out there as home gardeners and make a difference, and to reduce your field food import bill and become food producers for yourself, for your families, and for your communities. I thank you for the time, and I thank you for your patience for listening.
All right, thank you, Brother Smith, Mr. Smith, sorry. So because of the time, I will just allow for 3 questions, and one of them is a live question. And thereafter, I will just give you the commendations and we can close off.
No problem at all.
All right, so the first question will be from Sharon. If you are still there, Sharon, please go ahead. All right, hold on.
Yeah, good morning.
Hi.
My tomato plants, they're growing well, but I've noticed the leaves are beginning to curl. That's one concern I have. The other one is that my flavor peppers, the leaves are large. I'm getting flowers and fruit, but the flowers are falling off the stems.
Okay then. So the flowers aren't holding, right? So
yeah,
the first question I'll answer is the curling. Now, regarding the curling, what is really happening there? It depends on where they're curling. First of all, there are 2 things that I would ask you to check for. Now, a leaf can curl because of 2 reasons. The first reason is that there's some insects, some sucking insects underneath the leaves. Generally, these, I didn't go into that. I removed that from this slide because I realized it would be too much, 1. And 2, I realized that there was a session that deal with pest and disease diagnosis. But what I would say to you is that if you look underneath your leaves and you observe aphids, you observe if I can just, if you allow me very quickly to just to share something very, very quickly. There's something that I have here. Let me just open it up very quickly so that I can just show you very quickly in answering your question. How do I do this now? Right, so share, and I think it was this one, right? And there is a path, right? So I'm not sure if you guys are seeing the screen. Are you seeing the screen?
Yes.
Right, excellent. So this is an aphid. So when you look underneath your screen, underneath your leaf, if you see this is a sucking insect. And they come in different colors as well too. So we have these aphids. We have these little white fellows here that we call white flies as well. And we have this thing called leaf miners, which is like a burrowing within the leaves, right? That you see here. Now, when we have these biting and sucking insects, what generally happens is that basically it will cause the leaves to curl. But not only will it cause the leaves to curl, because remember it's taking on some of the nutrients, sugars, etc. What it will also do is that these biting and sucking insects, such as the whitefly and the aphids, they also carry viruses. And you remember viruses, you can't see with the naked eye, as with human viruses, similarly to plant viruses. So therefore, when they bring the virus, what happens is that an effect of the virus really is these curling of the leaves, similar to what you're seeing here. So if you realize here, you're seeing these white flies, but you're also seeing the curling of the leaves. So that signifies that, listen, there's a viral infection, as well as it also signifies that there's some sucking pest as well, right? So that's the first thing to answer your question. So it means that you have to now look at developing either an organic pesticide, whether you're utilizing your neem, your soap water, your cinnamon, your garlic, your onion, whatever it is, or you're going to the garden store and you're buying your organic sprays like your Cure, your Numectin, or, you know, and all of these different things. You have to get that to treat your plant, especially when it's at an advanced stage. The last question that you were asking me, I think, had to do with the blossom falling off. If the blossoms are falling off, it tells me that there's a nutritive problem. Particularly, as I mentioned, some of the nutrients that are required to hold the blossom, the calcium, the magnesium, the phosphorus, and the potassium are very important. So these blossom, so you can go to the garden store and buy a blossom booster, you know, or nutrients that are very good for flowering or for fruiting. Generally, these nutrients will now help the plant to hold on to the blossom and to convert that blossom through pollination into fruits. Yeah?
All right, so we're going very quickly. So let me just say that the other questions that were asked, they will be answered on Google Classroom. So it will be shared with Dr. Isaac as well as Mr. Smith. It will be answered and then the questions will be seen on Google Classroom because we have about 27 questions remaining. And due to the time, it's not possible to get through it. A question from Azil says that, can sargassum be added to compost, and what is the best way to use sargassum in gardening?
Sargassum. All right, sargassum can be added to compost, but one of the things you have to be careful of is that it's a wet material, as well as it has a high salinity and salt content. So because it's a wet material, you need to add a lot of bulking agents. And I didn't speak about that, but bulking agents are basically anything that gives bulking compost. Because remember, I said compost loses a lot of its mass. So you want to add a bulking agent such as sawdust. And what this sawdust does is that it absorbs some of the moisture, as well as you want to ensure that you would have bleached a lot of the salts out of your sargassum, because if the sargassum is very salt and you get a compost that is high, has a high EC or salt content, when you apply that to the plant, it will be detrimental. In terms of in the garden, what the sargassum does is that it does a similar thing to what we were speaking about earlier, which is the induced systematic resistance, the induced resistance where it primes the plant or builds the immune system of the plants. So the oligosaccharides or the carbohydrates that are found in the seaweed, when you mix that, generally, and you spray that on your plant, and obviously, you know, you have to get rid of a lot of the salt, it boosts the defense system of the plant to withstand diseases and also improves the nutrient status or its ability to utilize nutrients when it's growing.
All right, 2 more questions and then we go to the comments. This comes from Gladys. She's saying that should the drum be open as I have experienced rats, etc., attacking the compost when it is open.
All right, so remember I discussed to you that if you see cockroaches, rats, earth maggots and stuff like that, it means that the ratio is off, the moisture is off. Remember we spoke about these quality indicators and all of these different things. It means that something is off if you're seeing that. Because if you have the ratios appropriately, you will not see a frog, you will not see any rats, you will not see any cockroaches. I guarantee that. The most that you will see in the bin is microbes building up. You see this mat of mycelium, like when you have bread that going moldy, you'll see these things, but you won't see these harmful, organisms in the compost pile. So it has a lot to do with monitoring and ensuring that your composting pile is monitored and set up properly to avoid these things.
All right, Cynthia, I would like you to repeat what you recommended to purchase for the failing of blossom.
Okay, right. So I recommended any blossom or fruiting fertilizer. So the fertilizer, you ask your garden store, ensure that it has phosphorus, potassium, a higher concentration. So it can have nitrogen, but it must have a higher concentration. Remember we spoke about the ratios, a higher concentration NPK, a higher concentration of P, which is phosphorus, and K, which is potassium, as well as if it has calcium and magnesium added, which is the plus, which is the secondary macronutrients. Those are very important. So in summary, ensure that it has a higher proportion of phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, and these nutrients will help with the holding of the blossom as well as the transformation of the blossom into fruit.
All right, so the last one, and then we go to the comments. It comes from the answer. She's asking, does ProMix have substantial nutrients in it?
ProMix does not have substantial nutrients in it. It's actually very inert. So that is why it's a good growing medium, because you can amend and add to it as you please for the plant that you desire to grow, which is why people use ProMix for a wide range of plants, especially as seedling starters for a wide range of seedlings. Because of that inert availability, it's good ability to support plant growth, as well as the ability for it to be amended with nutrients and all these other things to support a healthy plant growth.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Mr. Smith. Let me share the comments with you. Latoya says that this presentation is a thorough blessing. She thanks you, and may God continue to bless you in wisdom and stature. Josephine says, thank you very much. This lecture was very beneficial. Lady J says, yay, I'm learning. Lennox says, thank you. It took me back to high school. I'm not too sure how way back that is for Lennox. Cynthia says, thanks a lot for this information. Very grateful. Kendra also says, thank you. It was very informative. And the last, well, Shondell is now saying thank you in all uppercase. And the last thank you comes from Oliver. He says, I am so grateful for this class. Very informative.
And I want to tell you guys that it was a pleasure having you. I enjoy the fact that you guys are engaged, and the fact that you guys sat through this presentation for X amount of hours. It means that you guys are really actively engaged in terms of changing the perspective of how we view agriculture. And I think that's very important, especially for our young people. You know, as mature individuals, that we set the right example, that we teach persons to produce their own food. You know, I have this philosophy that I'll share in closing, that if a man can feed himself, he's empowered in so many ways. You know, that he doesn't engage crime, you know, certain different things. There's so much empowerment that comes through agriculture. It breaks so many status quo. It breaks so many, you know, things that we ascribe to agriculture, so many negative connotations like the plantation system and all of these different things. So I'm happy for this initiative that the church has put on. I'm also happy to see that persons are dedicated to the initiative, meaning that they were steadfast and stayed throughout the presentation. And I just want to say that, you know, continue to engage your curiosity and be scientists, you know, in your own garden. And it was a pleasure doing this lecture with you guys today.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I'm going to hand over to Dr. George.
Okay. Yes, everybody. Well, you all already said your thank yous, but I just want to say thank you to Mr. Smith for such an excellent and well executed presentation. I think he was very, I don't know, he was just excellent. Yeah, very thorough, right? He covered some of the things I touched on last week, and he explained it even better than me, right? So let's continue to work with one another and to and to plod around on our gardens. And as he said, this is a very good initiative, and we're so happy to have so many of you staying until the end. I think we started off at 20 something. We went up in the 40s, we went up to the 60, and now we went back down to 45, right? I guess lots of people, this is Sunday morning, so people have their stuff to do. But Mr. Smith, we thank you again for this presentation. As I mentioned to you before, we are recording, and I have tried to add you to Google Classroom, so you will go there and you will try to upload the additional information that you mentioned to us earlier. All right, and again, I want to thank Ms. Green for being our hostess, our moderator, and for taking the questions. Again, she wasn't feeling so well this morning, but she stuck right through to the end, and I want to thank you again for that. All right, so
You're
next
welcome.
week we'll meet again at the same time from 9 o'clock. And we will have with us Dr. Mark Woodivera. So he'll be doing some irrigation principles with you all. So again, thank you and enjoy the rest of your week.
All right, guys, I'm going to unmute everyone. So you're welcome, Mr. Smith, so that you all could tell Mr. Smith a chorus of goodbye. All right, go ahead.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Pastor Clark.
Thank you. Yes, wonderful session.
Bye. Let's say.
All right, so Mr. Smith, there you have it. You got a wonderful choir rendition of saying their goodbyes. All right, Dr. George, I'm here. I'll just stay until the end before everyone signs off.
All right, okay, thanks. I get the
Hi,
question.
hi, Dr. Wendy.
Hi.
Yeah, I still can't access the Google Classroom. I don't have.
You want to send another email address, because I used the email address that I was given on the registration form for you all. So probably if you have a second email address, I could probably add you today itself.
I had WhatsApp one to you, but I don't know if I got it. I WhatsApp one to you during the week, last week.
Well, I probably tried to add you already. So check, because it went through. Let me just check again. I think that one went through. All right, no, I'm not seeing. You sent it to me. You sent it in the group chat?
I sent it on the WhatsApp chat when I spoke to you on the WhatsApp. I sent it to you and I sent it to you.
Privately, or because I'm not seeing it on the group? I look privately and I'm not seeing it.
I had spoken to you on the WhatsApp. So
Okay.
I just responded back on the WhatsApp.
All right, because if a couple of people sent it to me this week and I immediately added them. So check again, otherwise I will do it again.
But how do you access the